Hello, and welcome back to the Electronic Intifada's live stream for Thursday, January 9th. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleagues Ali Abu Nima, Jon Elmer, Asa Winstanley, and Tamara Nassar. It's day 461 as we enter the 16th month of Israel's genocide in Gaza. Coming up, we'll talk about Israel's plans to shut down the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees, and we'll be joined by Chris Gunness, who served as UNRWA's spokesperson for more than a decade. Later on in the program, Jon will bring us up to date on all the latest resistance news from Gaza, with a focus on Jabalia and Beit Hanun. But before we go to the news, hopefully we are joined by Donya Abu Sitta in Gaza. Donya is one of our contributors, and she's also an elementary school teacher. Is Donya with us? I think she's not yet. Okay, so we will come back to Donya after the news. Here's a brief summary of some of the latest developments this week in Gaza. Israel has continued its systematic campaign of destruction of Gaza, especially in the north, through the start of the new year. The head of the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees legal office, Philippa Greer, posted this video on December 31st and stated, quote, "Gaza's carcass. More homes convert to graves as the year draws to a close. Vast areas are stripped down to a bare shell. As conditions for life decompose, the lifesavers, the truth tellers, and the aid providers are killed and detained from blackened hospitals, scorched vans, and shelled humanitarian facilities. There is no space for the living, and the graveyards are full. 2024 fades, trust in our shared sense of humanity along with it." The Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza officially recorded the killing of 395 Palestinians and 936 injuries between December 30th and January 8th alone. The UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, reported that during the first 7 days of the new year, at least 74 children were killed in Israeli attacks. UNICEF's executive director, Catherine Russell, said that, quote, "For the children of Gaza, the new year has brought more death and suffering from attacks, deprivation, and increasing exposure to the cold." The agency warned that the continued lack of basic shelter, combined with winter temperatures, pose serious threats to children. With more than 1 million children living in makeshift tents, and with many families displaced over the past 15 months, children face extreme risks. Since December 26th, 8 newborn babies have died from hypothermia. In a feature we published on January 4th, our contributor Tagreed Ali writes that, quote, "Children, particularly infants, bear the brunt of the suffering in winter. They are ill-equipped for the cold and generate less body heat than older children or adults. With famine stalking Gaza and no protection from the elements, children are already physically weakened, leaving them less able to fight off hypothermia." Tagreed profiled grieving parents and Dr. Ahmed Al-Farah, the head of pediatrics at Nasser Hospital. Al-Farah told the Electronic Intifada that his department has been receiving more than 5 cases per day of children suffering from hypothermia. Tagreed writes that Sila Al-Fasih succumbed to the cold on Christmas Day. She was just 2 weeks old. Her family, originally from Gaza City, lives in a dilapidated tent with no nylon over it to give protection from the rain on the shores of Al-Mawasi Beach in Khan Yunis in the southern Gaza Strip. At night, Sila's mother, Nariman Al-Fasih, 35 years old, said that the family only has 3 blankets to protect the 5 of them. In addition to Sila, there is Nihad, 2 years old, and Rayan, 4, from the freezing cold. It wasn't enough for Sila. Al-Fasih woke at 4 a.m. to breastfeed, only to find her baby daughter unresponsive, her skin a deadly pallor of blue. For more, read Tagreed Ali's feature, Frozen to Death, on electronicintifada.net. On our last live stream, we reported on Israel's abduction and subsequent disappearing of Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya, the director of the Kamal Adwan Hospital in Beit Lahia in the north of Gaza. The hospital was surrounded and destroyed by Israeli forces on December 27th, after more than 80 days of relentless attacks because doctors refused to abandon their patients and staff. Abu Sitta has still not been heard from, although the Geneva-based Euromed Human Rights Monitor said it had received information that, quote, his health has deteriorated due to the torture he endured during his detention, particularly while being held at the Sde Teiman military base in southern Israel. Euromed Human Rights Monitor warns of the grave risk to his life following patterns of deliberate killings and deaths under torture previously suffered by other doctors and medical staff arrested from Gaza since October 2023. The human rights group added that it had collected testimonies, quote, confirming that Israeli soldiers physically assaulted Dr. Abu Sitta immediately after he left the hospital on Friday, December 27th. He was then directly targeted with sound bombs while attempting to evacuate the hospital in compliance with orders from the Israeli army, Euromed added. The Israelis, quote, subsequently transferred Dr. Abu Sitta to a field interrogation site in the Al-Aqsa area of Jabalia refugee camp. There, he was forced to strip off his clothes and was subjected to severe beatings, including being whipped with a thick wire commonly used for street electrical wiring. Soldiers deliberately humiliated him in front of other detainees, including fellow medical staff. He was later taken to an undisclosed location before being transferred to the Sde Teiman military camp under Israeli army control. Recently released detainees from Sde Teiman told Euromed Human Rights Monitor that Dr. Abu Sitta, quote, was subjected to severe torture, leading to a significant deterioration in his health. This occurred despite him already being injured by Israeli airstrikes on the hospital, where he worked tirelessly until the facility was stormed and set ablaze by Israeli forces. The Israeli army has attempted to mislead the public regarding Dr. Abu Sitta's detention and torture, Euromed stated. Pro-Israeli media outlets circulated a misleading promotional video portraying his treatment as humane, even though he was tortured and humiliated immediately after filming. On January 2nd, Physicians for Human Rights Israel had submitted a request on behalf of Abu Sitta's family to obtain information about his condition and facilitate a lawyer's visit. But the Israelis claimed to have no record of his detention. Euromed Monitor warned that Abu Sitta could face a similar fate as Dr. Adnan al-Bursh, head of the orthopedics department at Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City. Dr. al-Bursh was killed by torture at Ofer prison last April. Another doctor, Abu Sitta's colleague Iyad al-Rantisi, who was the head of the obstetrics department at Kamal Adwan Hospital, was also killed by torture at an Israeli Shin Bet facility 1 week after he was detained in November 2023. Euromed added that Israel concealed his death for more than 7 months. On Tuesday, Dr. Hussam Abu Sitta's mother died of a heart attack. As we reported, her grandson, Hussam Abu Sitta's son, Ibrahim, was killed by an Israeli drone strike in October. Hussam Abu Sitta led the funeral prayers for Ibrahim before burying him in the hospital's courtyard, and at the time he accused the Israeli army of killing his son as a punishment for refusing to abandon the hospital and his staff and patients. With the total decimation of Kamal Adwan Hospital, as well as the Indonesian hospital, and the prevention by the Israelis of any medical workers to enter the north of Gaza, there is only one hospital left, which is barely operating. The aid group Relief International reports that Al-Aqsa Hospital in Jabalia is the last medical facility in the north, and it is hanging on by a thread. On January 3rd, Al-Aqsa received orders to forcibly remove all hospital staff and patients, quote, or else the facility would be bombed, including all of those inside, Relief International stated. The group added that the hospital has been targeted, destroying the fuel tank and last running generator as shelling in the surrounding area continues. 63 staff and 34 patients remain inside. The facility has no electricity, but continues to receive patients, providing the best possible treatment with no fuel and a severe shortage of medication and medical supplies. The United Nations warned on Wednesday that, quote, zero fuel reserves to operate electricity generators at hospitals across Gaza are placing the lives of patients, including newborns, at grave risk. On Wednesday, the Nasser Medical Complex in Khan Yunis announced that all generators at the facility have stopped, and only a small generator is currently operating with an amount sufficient for 3 hours. In a press conference also on Wednesday, the Ministry of Health in Gaza stated that there is no fuel stock in hospitals due to the restrictions imposed on fuel entry and looting, warning that if no additional fuel is received, this will cause a catastrophe affecting the functioning of oxygen generators, medicine refrigerators, and incubators. The health ministry added that a patient died on Wednesday due to the lack of fuel needed to operate kidney dialysis machines. Hours later, the ministry reported that a small amount of fuel to operate hospital generators was received, which would allow for only 24 hours of continuation of services. Our contributor Abubaker Abed reported on the kidney disease crisis across Gaza. In a feature we published yesterday, Abubaker profiled several patients as well as Abdul Nasser Abu Aisha, the head nurse of the dialysis department at Al-Aqsa Hospital in Deir Balah. When the war broke out, we had 106 kidney patients here at the hospital, Abu Aisha said. When the Israeli military launched its ground operations in Rafah in early May, we ended up with nearly 5 times this number. The numbers of kidney patients have come down now, Abu Aisha said, because half the patients have died in the meantime of various causes, mostly related to hospital overcrowding and the general conditions in Gaza. In order to manage kidney disease, Abubaker reports, people are usually told to avoid dirty water and eat a balanced diet. But most humanitarian food assistance comes in the form of canned foods that are not healthy for kidney patients. The preservatives in canned food turn into toxins, taking a heavy toll on their health, Abu Aisha said. And with health services debilitated and medicines scarce, medical professionals are struggling to cope. The war must stop now, Abu Aisha said. There is no other solution. Abubaker spoke to a 14-year-old boy, Imad, who nearly died when he fell into a coma during one visit to the hospital. Quote, the boy also has anemia and inflammation and struggles to stand on his feet, his father said. And then there is the pain. My legs always hurt me, Imad told the Electronic Intifada. I can't sleep or do anything. I also haven't eaten bread for 2 days. I don't want to see these tubes on my body anymore. I just want to be like other children, and I want to go home with my family. For more, read Abubaker Abed's feature, Kidney Patients Face Excruciating Death in Gaza, on electronicintifada.net. Israel is continuing not just to prevent humanitarian aid, fuel, medicines, and food as the ethnic slaughter entrenches in North Gaza, but it is also continuing to destroy the aid and kill those delivering it. Israeli forces are also bolstering and supporting the actions of armed gangs in looting and deliberately undermining social order. According to the aid group Oxfam this week, quote, of the meager 34 trucks of food and water given permission to enter the North Gaza Governorate over the last 2.5 months, deliberate delays and systematic obstructions by the Israeli military meant that just 12 trucks managed to distribute aid to starving Palestinian civilians. For 3 of these, once the food and water had been delivered to the school where people were sheltering, the school was then cleared and shelled within hours. Sally Abi Khalil, Oxfam's Middle East and North Africa director, stated, quote, the situation in Gaza is apocalyptic and people are trapped, unable to find any kind of safety. The absolute desperation of having no food or shelter for your family in the biting cold of winter. It is abhorrent that despite international law being so publicly violated by Israel and starvation being used relentlessly as a weapon of war, world leaders continue to do nothing. The United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Tom Fletcher, stated on January 6th that the UN's efforts to save lives are at a breaking point. Fletcher said that, quote, an Israeli strike seriously injured 3 people at a known food distribution point where a partner of the World Food Program was operating. Israeli soldiers fired over 16 bullets at a clearly marked UN convoy at the checkpoint from the south to the north. Armed Palestinian gangs hijacked 6 fuel tankers entering from the Kerem Shalom crossing, leaving us hardly any fuel for aid operations. These incidents are part of a dangerous pattern of sabotage and deliberate disruption. Fletcher added that on January 3rd, Israeli forces increased attacks during the movement of a 74-truck aid convoy. A drone strike hit a vehicle from the local community, which was protecting part of the convoy. And just a few days ago, a UN mission out of Jabalia ran into hostile Israeli soldiers who threatened critical patients and arrested 4 of them. There is no meaningful civil order, Fletcher stated. Israeli forces are unable or unwilling to ensure the safety of our convoys. Statements by Israeli authorities vilify our aid workers even as the military attacks them. Community volunteers who accompany our convoys are being targeted. There is now a perception that it is dangerous to protect aid convoys, but safe to loot them. Euromed Human Rights Monitor reported this week that Israel's support of organized gangs in Gaza in order to steal humanitarian aid is a deliberate attempt to, quote, spread chaos and insecurity as part of its genocidal war and create disastrous conditions that will result in the destruction of Palestinians in the Strip as a whole. Israel's army has attempted to target members of the security and civil police forces, as well as individuals working to coordinate the entry of humanitarian aid. Since the start of its genocide on October 7th, 2023, Israel has been targeting members of these groups or teams while they are working, and even while they are in their homes or shelters, Euromed added. The Gaza government media office stated on January 2nd that the Israeli army assassinated Major General Mahmoud Salah, the Director General of the Palestinian Police in the Gaza Strip, and his assistant, Major General Hussam Shawan, quote, in a cowardly assassination operation that targeted them while they were performing their national and humanitarian duty in the Al-Mawasi area in Khan Yunis in southern Gaza, which the occupation claims is a safe humanitarian area, resulting in more martyrs and wounded. The media office warned that, quote, this escalation comes within a clear plan by which the Israeli occupation aims to create an administrative and governmental vacuum and spread chaos and security chaos in the Gaza Strip in an attempt to undermine the steadfastness of our people and destabilize them. The horrific rise in the number of martyrs of aid workers to 736 shows the extent of the crimes committed by the occupation, which targets everyone who tries to provide aid and relief to our afflicted Palestinian people. Israel killed 2 journalists in Gaza this past week. On January 2nd, Israel killed Hassan al-Kashawi in a drone strike. And on January 3rd, Omar Salah al-Dirawi, who is a photojournalist and worked with a number of news agencies, was killed in an Israeli bombing of his house in the Az-Zuwayda area in the central Gaza Strip, according to the Gaza government media office. This brings the number of journalists and media workers killed by Israel since October 2023 to 202. Finally, as we always do, we wanted to share images of people expressing defiance and resilience in the face of Israel's campaign of destruction. Twitter ex-user Noor Gaza posted these photos of birds on top of her tent after a rainstorm. She says, quote, I didn't want to let all the rainwater fall off the top of the tent so the birds could drink from it. Ali Juma of North Gaza posted this video of himself, his friend, and children playing during a hailstorm.
ثلج ثلج انها تمطر ثلج على شعب غزه الغلبان اطفال غزه الابرياء هم اطفال غزه الابرياء والله حجار ايوه والله ثلج يح طلع كله
And journalist Anas al-Sharif, who is one of the remaining reporters in North Gaza and has been separated from his family because of his work, was reunited with his baby son Salah this week.
يلا 1 2 انا تعليق حسين صلوح يا روح يا روح يا الله.
And that's it for the news roundup. As always, go to electronicintifada.net for much more, especially to read our new features by our brave writers in Gaza, and also to read Tamara Nassar's important coverage of the situation in the occupied West Bank, which I did not have time to get to in this newscast. You're watching the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleague Ali Abunimah. Hi, Ali.
Hi, Nora. Thank you for that. It's been just an unbearable week in so many ways. Now, day 461 of this, and the news of Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya's mother passing away just brings home the scale of the so many personal tragedies that are just unbearable. And where is he? Why is he not free? Where is he?
Right. Yeah. The very loud silence of every single medical association in the so-called West, who, did not protect him while he was begging for protection during those 80 days of absolute relentless siege on his hospital and on his staff and patients, and now haven't said anything about his probable torture and detention in, as Euromed says, in Side Teman torture camp.
Where doctors have been, and medics and others have been tortured to death, like Dr. Adnan al-Bursh.
Yeah. It's incomprehensible. But Ali, I believe we do have Donya Abu Sitta live from Gaza with us. Donya, are you there?
Yes.
Hi, Donya. It's so good to see your face. Hi.
Hello, Donya.
I just want to remind people that, Donya, you are a writer, you are a poet, and you're also an elementary school teacher. And we wanted to have you back on because you wanted to come back on and talk about what you've been working on, what is going on right now in Gaza, where you are. How are you?
I'm really good. I wanted to tell you that I'm gonna the workspace to make live stream. Now I'm in the phone live workspace in the middle of Khan Yunis, which take 50 minutes to return to home. Yes, it's difficult to join to get out from this time, but I'm determined to speak to you to show our safar, and this speaking to you is worth it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
As Karim Shadli says, it's one life we live, but I wonder how many times can we die? Life is a fragile thing, but what happens when death keep knocking at the door time after time? In Gaza, we die thousands times, not just once. You can die from hunger. Do you remember Yazan al-Kafarna? His eyes full of dreams. Not just only Yazan who died because of hunger. There are more than 40 people died because of hunger, as the United Nations posted. And also you can die because of cold. Can you imagine that your body is freezing and you cannot have blanket or warmth or anything, just cold? And the blood in your feet and hands is freezing. It's not just a cold from the weather only, but watching your loved ones are freezing instead in front of you, and you helpless while all the world is still silent. There are more than 7 kids were died because of the cold. Aisha, Sila, Ali, Jum'a, Ahmed, and so on. Now I wanna ask Tamara if she can share the first poem, which title only 20 days old.
Donya, do you want to read this or do you want me to read it?
You, if you can read it.
I will try. It's always best when the author of the poem reads her work, but I am honored to read this for you. Only 20 days. My beautiful little one with the scent of musk, wondering, what is your fault? You spent just 20 days of your life. I watched you fade away slowly, piece by piece. But I have died 1,000 deaths for you. I couldn't shield you from the bitter cold, nor protect you from its silent attack, nor prevent that damn thief from sneaking into the tent, penetrating your bones. I have come to hate the sea, the tent, the winter, and even the gentle breeze. 20 days, they were the most beautiful days of my life, but they became my whole life. You welcomed life with cheerful face, a heart full of hope, but life cruelly failed you. Only 20 days. Beautiful, Donya.
Yes, you can also die because, and while you are still alive. I cannot bear that situations in my imaginations. What about people who live that moments? Imagine your body is under the rubble of your house, hearing people shouting outside. Is there anyone still alive? You wanted to reply, but your voice is trapped inside you. You wonder how many hours can I still alive under the rubble? 2, 3, or maybe 6. But what will happen next? Are that the race that you must win? What about your family members? Is this in these situations there just only one winner, you or maybe your family, but you don't make the decision. Your side and available civil defense equipments make. Mahmoud Basal, the speaker man for civil defense, said, due to the lack of equipment, civil defense forces and volunteers are using their hands to help people under the rubble. They rely on daylight to carry out their work, but the occupation has increasingly targeted homes at the night, forcing them using mobile phone flashlights to help people and help survivors. Sadly, sometimes they were killed and targeted. There are more than 79 people were killed in their stuff. The United Nations state in their report in May 2024, the number of missing people has over than 10,000. Let me tell you about the Qut family. In Al-Nusayran camp, the house was bombed, and the family remained under the rubble for hours. Lara, 6 years old, and Yara, 16 years old. They still under the rubble for 8 hours. After that, the people around them was asking, there is anyone still alive? They wanted to reply, but no voice come out. So civil defense start to go out to back to the the main or the central point. But after that, someone shout, there is a hand moving under the rubble. That's isn't Yara hands, but it's her sister's Lara. So they return to work and get Lara and Yara um, to the hospital, and they still alive. But Yara asking, is this alive? Maybe her life after this hours become more worse than the death. Now I'm asking Tamara if she could share the second poem.
And this one is called Will I Survive? Yes, Yara, you will survive. But what is a survival? After the rubble of your house pressed on your chest for hours, after you inhaled air filled with dust, you waited. Hours felt like days. Questions swirled in your mind, unanswered. Tears and blood stained your fragile body, turning you red as dusk. You collapsed, then returned to life, to the sound of "Are there anyone alive?" Next to you, Lara, just 6 years old, moaning in pain. Neither of you can speak, but survival comes, even if delayed, shouting, "There is a hand moving under the rubble."
This is a poem I wrote it for Yara because to answer the questions that she was wondering about the answer when she was under the rubble. Also, the lack of equipment for civil defense make the main major problem when they can get people, because all or most the cars of the civil defense was damaged. And for example, there is actions that happened in Deir al-Balah. The father get out his daughter from under the rubble and go it to the hospitals. When he arrived, the doctor asked him, "Where is the hand?" The left hand of the daughter, and the father recalled for his brother and ask them to go to that place and bring the arm. When they bring, they can the doctor make an operations for the girl, and that her hands is okay now. And that's because in Deir al-Balah there is some equipment available, but in Khan Yunis and in the north there is nothing, because when the Israeli occupations enter these areas, damaged everything in these areas. The war is long when you wait for the people to get you out of the from the under the rubble, and that means you and you wonder if the oxygen is run off. What will happen if you bending and blending and have many injuries? What will? How can you help yourself?
It's just unimaginable. And Donya, thank you for sharing those beautiful poems, which are inspired by these real life events. It's hard to think of something beautiful coming out of something so horrible. But what can you tell? Do you know anything about what happened to Yara?
Yes, Yara now has many. Now she is disabled. He have many injured in his leg and arms, and also Lara has the same thing.
Yeah.
They are still in the hospital.
And we hope that they will recover, but there are so many children who have lost. I mean, Gaza has the largest number of amputee children in the world. May I ask you, Donya, about you? As Nora mentioned, you're a teacher and you work with children. You love the children you work with. We've seen that in so many ways. You and your sisters and your family do wonderful work with children. Tell us about the children you're working with now and how they're doing and what you're doing with them.
As you know, the education ministry in the state of Palestine posted that the children must return to electronic or online learning. So the students don't have mobiles, don't have internet. So there is have many suffering. Days before, I saw a young child that asking her mother, "How can I continue my studying while I don't have a phone?" Or you and his mother didn't have also a phone. I wanted to be at the same class as my colleagues. He said to his mother, but his mother have no answers because there is nothing she can do.
But you have children who come every day and you teach them. Can children learn in this kind of environment?
Yes, we deal with the children to let them forget the war or have something fun to continue their lives because they are so little. They must or they have the right of life. So we can make as possible as we can to let them forget or help them to recover from the war impacts.
Donya, it is just it continues to be just so unbearable. Can you talk a little bit more about the conditions that some of your students and their families are living in? I mean, we talk about the bitter cold in Gaza at this time of year, people in tents that are completely inappropriate for this kind of weather, nylon or canvas. There's barely any infrastructure. Can you talk about where your children go after they, spend a few hours at a school?
Yeah. Intense, there is more suffer than you can imagine. I cannot reflect that suffering by the words because no one can understand or feel that suffer if he or she didn't live it, because that is more than imaginable things. People are living in tents in the on the beach. The cold is very high, and the winds and the rain. We People start to pray. I wanted the skies didn't rain this winter. I heard that child that says, "I hope this winter isn't rain anymore."
Well, Dunya, finally, what are you how are you spending your days? What are the stories that are coming to you and that you're writing about? How do you find the motivation to keep writing and to keep teaching and to keep doing whatever you can right now under these conditions?
Actually, that patience or motivations I get it from my children's, my students. I mean, because if they younger than me, but they have the hope to study to continue their lives, I can do the same thing. We are spend time together, play or learning, and at the same time, I learn from my students because they are so tough and they have great power to continue to make something new, to exposure, to find anything to spend their times. But it's return to their natures that they wanna the useful things they read and write. For example, I read for them the stories, and after that, I ask them who can retell us that stories.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Dunya. It's always such an honor to have you here with us and to publish your work on the Electronic Intifada. We're so grateful for all the time that you spend with us.
It's my pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you. And Ali, you're muted. There you go.
Yeah, and Dunya, you came a long way. You had to cross a long distance tonight in Gaza to come to find a place where you could have electricity and internet to speak to us.
Yeah.
It wasn't easy, and we're grateful that you did that, and we wish you a very safe journey back home to your family, and that you'll join us again soon. And please give your family all our love from us and from everyone who's watching. And in the comments, I can see lots of people from all over the world thanking you for the work you're doing and for the writing and for everything that you're giving us. We're so grateful to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Donya. Oh, I'm so glad she was able to. Oh God, I can't even imagine the arduous journey of trying to get to a place that has stable enough internet. But yeah, as you said, we're so grateful. We're so honored and proud of her and her whole family. I'm really glad that we had her on. Well, we have so much more to bring you today. Ali, do you want to introduce Chris?
Yes, absolutely. And just a reminder, you're watching the Electronic Intifada live stream, and I'm here with my colleague Nora Barrows-Friedman. And last week, the New York Times claimed that UN officials are preparing to shutter UNRWA operations in both Gaza and the Israeli-occupied West Bank. This is because of a law passed by the Israeli parliament in late October prohibiting the UN agency that serves Palestinian refugees from operating in the occupied Palestinian territories. That law is set to take effect in just a couple of weeks' time at the end of January. The Israeli parliament had previously voted to declare UNRWA a terrorist organization. After Israel passed the anti-UNRWA laws at the end of October, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres affirmed, quote, that UNRWA is the principal means by which essential assistance is supplied to Palestine refugees in the occupied Palestinian territory, adding that there is no alternative to UNRWA. And the agency's communications director, Juliette Touma, said that in Gaza, quote, without UNRWA, it is safe to say people will die. More people will die. UNRWA is a lifeline for some 6 million Palestinian refugees in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. Its tens of thousands of workers provide basic health, education, job training, and other vital services. In Gaza, amid the ongoing genocide, it is the only organization with the capacity to distribute life-saving food to any significant number of Palestinians living there. Lives literally depend on its work. But UNRWA has denied the claim reported in the New York Times that it is getting ready to shut down its operations. The agency's Commissioner General, Philippe Lazzarini, said last week that UNRWA's teams are, quote, committed to stay and deliver. He called Israel's latest moves against UNRWA part of broader efforts to erase Palestinian history and identity. Lazzarini noted that since the genocide began, nearly 2 million people in Gaza have received food assistance from UNRWA, and hundreds of thousands of people displaced in Gaza are living in UNRWA shelters. And just today, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, the head of the World Health Organization, said no other aid agency can match the level of support UNRWA provides to people in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. He said, quote, with about 1,000 health workers, UNRWA handles over 16,000 medical consultations per day, including for childhood vaccinations, maternal health services, malnutrition screening, and mental health support. No other agency can match this scale. Banning UNRWA will only deepen the suffering of the people in need of life-saving care. End quote. The vast majority of UNRWA's workers, including thousands still in Gaza, are themselves Palestinian refugees. During the course of this genocide, up until the end of 2024, Israel has killed almost 260 UNRWA workers. At least 745 people have been killed and more than 2,200 injured by Israeli attacks on UNRWA shelters, and hundreds of UNRWA facilities have been attacked. At least 20 UNRWA staff are currently in Israeli detention, and those previously released have described systematic mistreatment, humiliation, and torture, according to Lazzarini. The looming Israeli move to totally outlaw UNRWA's operations in the West Bank and Gaza Strip is not the first threat to the agency, but it may be the most serious. Joining us now to talk about all this is Chris Gunness, who served as UNRWA's spokesperson for more than a decade, including during Israel's 2014 war on Gaza. Chris, it's been almost a year since we had you on the Electronic Intifada live stream, and we're so glad you could join us again today.
It's a real pleasure to be with you, Ali, and also with Nora. Nora, thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks,
Thank you, Chris.
Good to have you.
Let's start with this looming threat by Israel to shut down its operations in just a few weeks' time. Do you think that will happen? And what do you think will happen if Israel does that?
Well, certainly there's a game of chicken going on, which is how one US official described this to the Axios news agency, which has been digging into this story and has come up with some quite revealing quotes. The Secretary General's position is Israel is the occupying power. Under the Fourth Geneva Convention, the occupying power has an obligation to provide services. Therefore, if UNRWA isn't going to provide them, schools, education, health, social services of all sorts, psychosocial support, then Israel is going to. Now, obviously, if you're a Palestinian in Gaza having a genocide committed against you, you hear that and you think, why is the world's top diplomat in charge of all of these humanitarian organizations, including UNRWA, mandated by the General Assembly to provide us with these services? Why is he saying that a genocidal state that's killing us and our children in our droves should be in control, in charge of delivering these services? That, I think, was a very tough message. It was a very top-down message for Palestinians to hear. And clearly the Secretary General's strategy is to suggest that there is no alternative, and therefore to prohibit any contingency planning. And indeed, Ali and Nora, I can confirm, there has been in UNRWA, and I speak to UNRWA people all the time, there has actually been no contingency planning. Now, on the other side, the threat against the Israelis, and I have to say, it seems that this is not a threat they particularly care about, is that they will be held up to international opprobrium. That's not happened. And that the world will say, you are in charge of these people, what are you doing? They're dying in their droves. So I have to say, for me, I have real problems with that strategy, with the idea that the Secretary General is playing chicken with the suffering of Palestinians as part of the currency of that game. For me, I think what he should be doing is calling out the Israelis, invoking Article 99 of the UN Charter, bringing the Security Council into session, saying, as he did in a letter to Benjamin Netanyahu, which has been released as a UN document, that the Knesset bills, the two bills, need to be withdrawn. They should not be implemented. He needs to call the General Assembly into session. It's the General Assembly and not a single rogue state that is in charge of giving UNRWA its mandate. And he needs to work the phones politically. Now, he seems to be saying, I'm not going to do that because it's Israel's responsibility. But I think that's a very problematic strategy, as I've said, and it has profound implications on the ground in terms of service delivery, and it has profound implications politically, because although UNRWA is saying we're not doing any contingency planning, I have seen communications sent to the donors on the 19th of December, and it's very clear the donors are being prepared for UNRWA staff members who are based in the UNRWA headquarters in Jerusalem to be relocated to Amman. There's a big headquarters building in Amman. And that begins to feel as if under pressure, UNRWA is going to buckle, and that the de facto annexation, the illegal annexation of Jerusalem, is going to be, let's just say the seal is going to be set on that. So there are huge operational issues with that, and maybe we can talk about that on the ground in Gaza. And there are massive political ramifications which ought to alarm Arab governments. The idea of the third holiest shrine in Islam, the city in which that exists, being annexed illegally by a member state of the United Nations that's committing a genocide against the Palestinians, that adds up to serious, increased tensions in a region which is already exploding with tensions. And, you know, Arab governments, those in the Middle East, should be extremely alarmed. The whittling down of UNRWA support, UNRWA staff in Jerusalem has enormous consequences for the whole region.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the donor countries. UNRWA is a UN agency, but it's funded largely by voluntary contributions from UN member states. And historically, the biggest funders have been the United States and EU countries. So in other words, Israel's biggest supporters and political allies. Can you talk to us about what this means in terms of the constant struggle by the agency to stay afloat and the political pressures it faces, and if there are any diplomatic efforts that are underway right now as this, you know, possible ban looms?
Well, in terms of the major donors, the Americans have passed congressional legislation, which basically means there will not even be discussion about resuming the $350 million annually, which the US used to give to UNRWA. I'm pleased to say that after the so-called Kelowna report came out into the allegations that UNRWA staff members were involved in the 10th of October attacks, that turned out to be complete nonsense. As I keep saying to people, there are all these allegations against UNRWA by Israel and its Hasbara allies around the world. If there was any evidence that was remotely going to stand up to scrutiny, it would have been handed over to Madame Kelowna, an independent report. This is not a UN report. Don't trust the UN. They're anti-Semitic, all that stuff. They could have given this evidence to an independent inquiry. When the inquiry came out, I looked at it thinking, where is this evidence going to be, with some trepidation? There was none. So Catherine Kedlona actually said, the headline was, look at the Washington Post, look at the Financial Times, look at Channel 4. It was all there. Israel had provided no evidence. And once that had come out, all the donors, the 16 donors who had defunded UNRWA, all of them except the Americans, came back. Now, the problem has been that since then, the need on the ground has risen exponentially. I mean, every time UNRWA would come out with what they call a flash appeal, it's out of date the next hour because there's so much conflict. There's these attacks by Israel on UNRWA workers, UNRWA facilities, on the aid convoys. It means it's impossible even to say what UNRWA's budget should be. So, that is an ongoing moving target. But I have to say, I mean, there are some donors, the Irish, the Spanish, the Norwegians. I mean, there are some who are standing by UNRWA, but it's really not enough. And as you quite rightly said, Nora, the big problem is the political support. I mean, you've quoted Tom Fletcher in your excellent news bulletin at the beginning of this program. And what Tom is basically saying is there's a genuine change in policy on the ground. So the UNRWA colleagues I talk to now say that the soldiers that the Israelis are moving in now are the really ideological, religious, settler units. And they are the ones who are shooting directly at aid convoys. So what you're now getting, and I think this is a change of policy in relation to UNRWA, and it's in preparation, I think, for this legislation which comes into force in the last week of this month. What's happening is that the 𝐄𝐥𝐞, which is the part of the IDF which deals with UNRWA, effectively they're there to enforce the collective punishment of the blockade, but UNRWA has to coordinate, is the language they use, to deconflict the aid corridors. And what 𝐄𝐥𝐞 is saying is we're not going to talk to UNRWA. We'll only talk to WFP and the other agencies. So whereas before the war, 85% of all the stuff coming from Ashdod into Gaza from the north, that's now changed. And there's been a massive decrease in the amount of aid that UNRWA is allowed to even bring in from outside Gaza. Once it's inside Gaza, then UNRWA is the only organization with the warehouses, the food distribution centers, the trucks, the vehicles, all of that. But UNRWA vehicles, UNRWA convoys, all UN convoys are being fired on. So although UNRWA is the backbone, as the Secretary General said, as you quoted him, Ali, the fact is that now seems to be a policy by Israel of moving in the most ideological, the most religious settlers. And even once the aid comes in, not brought in largely by UNRWA, but by other agencies, the policy is to disrupt the aid convoys and shoot at the people in charge of the convoys while allowing these criminal gangs to loot the convoys. And what that effectively allows Israel and its spokespeople to do is say, we're bringing in all the aid that is needed in Gaza, it's pouring through, and of course WFP and others are bringing all this stuff in. But UNRWA is not fit for purpose, it's useless, and therefore, it's UNRWA that's to blame. But of course, that is a lie. And because international journalists and others are not really allowed into Gaza to do their job, Israel gets away with these lies time and time again. So in the very sorry situation where as this deadline for the legislation to come into force approaches, UNRWA's role is being deliberately reduced by the Israeli army. The role of WFP, of course, headed up by an American, they're under great pressure from the American administration to take over all this stuff from UNRWA. Meanwhile, in Gaza itself, UNRWA is being, the problems that UNRWA are having are increasing. So basically, as one colleague in UNRWA put it to me, operations of UNRWA that are reliant on the supply line, so food and stuff coming in, they can't really do much of that. But when it comes to, as Tedros says, supporting the child immunization, the vaccine program, the polio program, UNRWA can be very active in that because it's got all of these facilities, more than half of them damaged or completely destroyed. It can do psychosocial support because miraculously, particularly in the south, quite a few of UNRWA's primary health clinics are going. It can do what they call solid waste disposal, which means cleaning out sewage from the refugee camps. So stuff that doesn't involve aid coming in. UNRWA's getting on with that, and UNRWA's doing an extraordinary job. I mean, it's deeply humbling hearing people like Donya. I mean, they are doing God's work, but there are thousands of UNRWA workers as I speak doing all this stuff: psychosocial support, the vaccine support, the housing in the shelters, water and sanitation. They're doing that as best they can, but there's a deliberate attempt in the run-up to this legislation coming into force to write UNRWA out of the picture. And we can talk about the politics behind that, but essentially that's what's going on the ground.
Well, yesterday I looked at UNRWA's budget that is on the UNRWA website that's projected for 2024 and 2025. And they list about, not to get too deeply into this, about $860 million of revenue, which is much less than they need. But it's extraordinary to me that they still have the United States marked as giving, I think it's something like 235 million, which seems, I don't know if that was the year completed, but that, I'm assuming the Trump administration is not going to give a penny to UNRWA. The Biden administration hasn't been giving a penny to UNRWA. The next biggest donor is the EU, which is about 100 million. So we're talking about needs of hundreds of millions, probably more, that where there's a shortfall. I mean, that's before we even get to these issues that I'm going to ask you more about in a moment. And I don't see many others stepping up. I mean, the richest Arab regimes that are sitting on their oil and gas wealth and sovereign wealth funds are giving 10, 20, 30 million. I mean, we're not talking about large amounts of money in the grand scheme of things. So I just wanted to put that out there, Chris. But I want to go back to some of the I want to ask you about some of the politics, but go ahead if you wanted to say something.
Just to say that, I mean, this is all about politics, right? So the Arab states have always said it was the Europeans who did the Holocaust, drove the Jews into Palestine, displaced all these people. It's the Americans who support the Israelis. So it's the Europeans and the Americans who can pay for all of the dealing with the refugee problem. So we're not going to give money to UNRWA. That's the responsibility of the Europeans who did the Holocaust and the Americans who support Israel. That's the politics behind that. Of course, the counter argument from UNRWA and others, though UNRWA is very polite to its Gulfy donors generally, is, look, this is your backyard. These are your Arab brothers. And if you're going to allow 5.9 million people to be stateless, to be homeless, to be living a life of destitution, that is going to excite the Arab street. And ultimately, given the context of the Middle East right now, that is going to lead to instability of the sort you really don't need and of the sort that will disrupt your economies and stop you being rich. That argument has no resonance whatsoever in the Middle East right now, as you can see from UNRWA's donor sheet that you've been reading, Ali. So it's all about politics. And here we are in a situation where the Americans and the Europeans are prepared to look at these pictures on their screens every day. That's partly because they're increasingly right-wing populist governments in Europe. But there is no genuine political support for coming to the succor of a people for whom the UN has, historic responsibilities and against whom this genocide is being committed. Israel has simply controlled the narrative and is prepared to sit this one out. And I think for many Israelis, particularly the far right in Israel, they're looking at this and saying, we've got a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to deal with the Palestinians, and UNRWA is a detail. We need to flick them into the long grass, and then we've just got to get the West Bank sorted out. That'll be annexed along with Jerusalem, and the Palestinian problem is solved for once and for all. Of course, that is a recipe for endless conflict. That is a recipe for Israelis and for Jews to be living in a state of perpetual fear and insecurity. They may be high on victory, they may be high on Palestinian blood right now, but believe me, as a long-term strategy, that is doomed to fail, as we all know.
Well, Chris, you've already, in a way, started answering my next question. You, of course, spent years at UNRWA fending off smears against the agency. You just talked about the latest false smears about UNRWA workers, but these sorts of smears by Israel and its lobby groups go back years and years and years. And Israel, of course, makes no secret of its hostility to UNRWA and its desire to see the agency disappear. But on the other hand, UNRWA is arguably a great asset to Israel because it relieves Israel of that obligation which it has under international law to provide these services to millions of people under its direct military occupation. What, in your opinion, what is it that drives this implacable Israeli hostility towards UNRWA? And you started saying it, but I want you to play it out a bit more. What is Israel's end game? I mean, what do they hope to achieve by destroying UNRWA?
So to be clear, on this question of Israel benefits by UNRWA's presence, let's even suppose UNRWA got all of its budget, the general fund, let's say that's about 1.5 million, and then emergency budgets, let's call that another. Let's call it $1 billion. Let's say it's a couple of billion. Well, for a state that receives that much money in a couple of months from America, Europe, wherever else, that's peanuts. By far the bigger issue for Israel, and it dwarfs this question of providing services and saving on money on having to deal with Palestinian schools, is the fact that Israel believes that by getting rid of UNRWA, you get rid of the Palestine refugees. Registered with UNRWA, there are 5.9 million refugees. They're in Jordan, they're in Syria, they're in Lebanon, they're in Palestine, i.e. Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. They're all there. And Israel thinks that if UNRWA disappears, then their rights, for example, the right of return, which is the very scary one for Israelis, they will somehow disappear. Now, as I've said time and time again, and as you well know, these are people with inalienable rights. And those rights existed before UNRWA. And if UNRWA is put out of business in the West Bank and Gaza, those rights will carry on pertaining. So it's a kind of mad right-wing Zionist fiction, a fantasy that by somehow destroying an agency which is mandated by the United Nations to serve this population, that by destroying that, you somehow get rid of these people, their history, their identity, their group rights, such as the right to self-determination, is of course fascistic nonsense. But it sells well in Israel, it goes well down in Israel, it possibly even helps win elections in Israel. But in terms of international law, the frameworks that exist in the sort of normal world of sanity, that isn't going to work, and it will fail. I mean, it's as simple as that. And by the way, one interesting thing, UNRWA has a digital registration and archival system. So documents going back to 1948 and beyond, so land deeds, property deeds, all of these sorts of deeds, which are evidence of what the Zionist movement has destroyed in part in Palestine. That's all there. And there is, even though it's gone into abeyance, it's around. There's a compensation mechanism. And there has been genuine talk, actually, amongst United Nations officials that I've spoken to very privately about reviving that compensation mechanism. Now, if that's going to happen, the digital archive and the documentation that UNRWA has is going to be incredibly useful. And interestingly, it was all taken out of Gaza in the early days of the war. So, really old documents in 1948 and beyond were smuggled out under the very noses of the Israelis in trucks. And they've all gone through to Amman, the headquarters in Amman, where the Relief and Social Services Department, which is, where this archival digital platform sits, they've actually recorded all this stuff. So even if UNRWA were destroyed, the digital system, the platform, which has recorded all of this Palestinian life and deeds and property on which these compensations claim would rest, that all exists in a digital cloud somewhere. So, Israel on many levels is kidding itself if it thinks by getting rid of UNRWA, it will get rid of the refugees as an issue in the Middle East peace process. The other really important thing, and I'd like to say something about this, if you don't mind, Ali and Nora, is the whole question of the annexation of Jerusalem. Now, we all know that, in 1967, it began. It's been recognized by nobody. It is illegal. It's been condemned. It's been outlawed. There's no question of that. But the de facto annexation of Israel, just like the de facto colonization of Palestine, has simply continued. And in the face of very little reaction, I would say virtual impunity from the international community, Israel has carried on with this. Now, the destruction of UNRWA and the attempt by Israel to shut down UNRWA is really important politically. Now, if you'll just give me some space here, Danny Danon, who is the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations in New York, he wrote a letter after the legislation was passed on the 28th of October. And his letter raised a whole load of objections about UNRWA being, overrun by Hamas and we're all terrorists and all that kind of stuff. But then there were some very interesting lines in it in which he talked about Jerusalem. And there was one particular line a paragraph in which he said, the Israeli government intends to take over the health and education services that UNRWA has been providing in Jerusalem. Now, if you look at UNRWA's website, it's got in 𝐓𝐡𝐞 refugee camp, just on the northern fringes of Jerusalem, there are 3 schools and there's a health center. There's a health center in the old city in Jerusalem. There's the Kalandia vocational training center. It's a huge, huge facility. I've spent many happy hours there. And then there's Kalandia camp, which has got clinics and schools. Now, the clear implication is that Israel intends to take all of those over. Now, already the Jerusalem municipality is delivering, in inverted commas, education to Palestinians living under occupation. It's caused great offense. And by the way, it's a violation of international humanitarian law. Israel has Judaized that curriculum, and that's caused deep resentment. But the implication from Ambassador Danon's letter is that those schools and those clinics will be taken over by Israel sometime after it's not clear whether it's the 26th of January, which is the 90 days after, or whether it's the 29th of January, which is what Israeli officials are telling UNRWA as the date when this legislation comes into force. But basically, sometime after that, it seems pretty clear that the Israeli government will take over these facilities under occupation against international law. They will take those over. But most important, the UNRWA compound, which is where my office used to be, now it's about 9 or 10 acres. It's huge. There are massive warehouses which food and other supplies used to come through. It's actually also not just where the Commissioner General and some of his key senior staff have their offices. That's where my office used to be. It's also the headquarters of the West Bank field office. So a lot of the stuff that goes into the camps in the West Bank goes through that compound. Now, 6 months or so ago, it was attacked. There was an arson attack. There have been 2 arson attacks. It had to be closed down. While the whole debate was going on in the Knesset, various Likud ministers have said that this compound should be confiscated, they should cut off electricity, they should cut off water, they should take away the deed, and that this compound should be handed over to settlers who would be able to make 1,440 housing units out of it. That seemed to be a very scarily precise calculation, like they'd done the measurements of what you can fit into 9 point whatever it is acres. Now, if that were to go, along with all of these other UNRWA facilities, the de facto annexation would basically be complete. The annexation of Jerusalem would be an established fact on the ground. Now, interestingly, what's happening, and there's been some kerfuffle within UNRWA about that, about 6 months to a year ago, UNRWA began a performance review amongst quite a lot of the staff who were based in Jerusalem. And they started to say to staff, while the Israelis were withholding visas, shortening the time that visas were given to UNRWA staff, there seemed to be a mood within UNRWA to try and find a pretext to start whittling things down. Now, this was partly operational. It's very hard to run an organization if your staff can't be at work. They're in a neighboring country like Amman. So I could understand the pressures that they were under. But the response appears to have been, and I say appears to have been, to start responding to the Israeli violence and the bullying and the bureaucratic pressures, to start whittling down the numbers in the Jerusalem HQ. Now, I have seen a communication sent to the donors on the 19th of December, and that basically says that in the face of all of these bureaucratic and political attacks, mainly bureaucratic attacks like visas, we're going to have to start thinking about closing this down. Now, it seems like a bureaucratic and operational decision, but it basically means that Jerusalem, home of the third most holy shrine in Islam, will become an annexed city. Now, I would like to think that if you are a Muslim, wherever you are in the world, but certainly in the Middle East, and certainly if you're a Palestinian, you would be deeply alarmed. Now, my hope is that Arab states, for example, Jordan, officially the guardian of the Holy Shrine, the Waqf, and the Saudis who are engaged in normalization talks with Israel, I mean, on, off, who knows, it's all shrouded in mystery, but I'd like to think that Arab states in the Gulf, led by, Ayman Safieddine, the Jordanian foreign minister, and others who've been active on this, would say to the Saudis, you cannot allow normalization to continue if Jerusalem is going to be annexed, and as part of that, if UNRWA is going to be destroyed, and that's, as I say, that's the political goal of destroying UNRWA within Jerusalem. And I mean, increasingly, there are signs that the Israelis want to annex the West Bank as well. So one would like to think that Jordan in particular, but other states, would take a very strong position and would make it very clear to the Saudis that normalization simply cannot happen unless Israel decides and makes clear that it's not going to implement this legislation, that it's going to back away from annexing Jerusalem and the West Bank, and it needs to move very swiftly obviously towards a ceasefire and the reconstruction of Gaza. Now, I would hope that the Arab states, who seem to be sleepwalking as ever into allowing Israel to establish these facts on the ground, that they would just wake up and that they would act swiftly. And I think, as I said in an earlier part of this interview, if the Secretary General were to use his powers, Article 99, bring the Security Council into session, make sure that dropping this legislation, backing away from the annexation of Jerusalem and the West Bank is agenda item number one, calling the General Assembly into session and say, you give UNRWA its mandate, look at what's happened to UNRWA, what's going to happen. In other words, moving the dial politically. Because as we've said time and time again, the humanitarian stuff that's going on in Gaza, terrifying and utterly disgraceful as it is, these are all manifestations of a political reality. And we need to shift the dial on that political reality if we're going to start seeing differences on the ground. My hope is that the potential loss of Jerusalem and its holy shrines will actually motivate Arab governments in the Middle East and Muslim people all around the world.
Chris, I'm I hear what you're saying, and I would share that.
I know what you're going to say.
Well, I mean, it's hard to hope for that. I mean, genocide hasn't woken them up. I mean, the fact that states as far away as Colombia and Bolivia and Venezuela have broken off diplomatic relations with Israel, and not a single Arab state has done so. Jordan, where I'm sitting right now, has not broken off its relations with Israel. I mean, the relations might not be very warm, but they're there, and they go on, and more goes on behind the scene than we see, of course. And the fact that there's any talk of Saudi normalization at all, when during a genocide, during a Holocaust, it doesn't give me a lot of hope. But I'm
with you. I mean,
but you have to say it. You have to say it. You have to say, so that no one can say that they didn't know. And it's just it's extraordinary to think what could happen. I mean, of course, Gaza is the most dire and acute situation, but the situation in the West Bank it gets somewhat overlooked because of the scale of the catastrophe in Gaza. But in historic terms, Chris, what's happening in the West Bank is very intense, isn't it? And when you talk about the needs of people in the West Bank, I mean, I remember many years ago, one of your colleagues who was based here in Jordan arranged for me to visit some of the UNRWA facilities in the refugee camps in Jordan, and so I could see firsthand the health facilities and the educational facilities and the incredible work. And that was what brought home to me that the work is done by Palestinians. You know, the top level managers, or many of them, are often international people, but they're a fraction of a percent of UNRWA staff. UNRWA is staffed by Palestinians, working for Palestinians, Palestinian refugees living in the camps with the population they serve. And we see that in Gaza, where people, you know, the UNRWA workers are refusing to leave their posts. They continue to do this work, and hundreds of them have been killed and injured in doing this work. What I'm getting at is that if you take that away in the West Bank, what does that mean for these communities? You just have a total collapse. I mean, I don't want to put it in the terms of, oh, if people lose material services and health and food, then they become less docile. I don't want to put it that way, but isn't that going to simply create the conditions for more support for resistance and more support for the things that Israel supposedly doesn't want?
Yeah, I mean, I think two things. I mean, first of all, as you quite rightly say, UNRWA in a way is a very neo-colonial organization. When I was there were 33,000 Palestinian staff and around 150 internationals. So, you know, that's the percentage you were talking about. And I always used to say to people, especially my international colleagues, you know, you can do what you like, but UNRWA will keep going because it's run by Palestinians who are living in these communities, and they know better than anybody else what human development means, because it's their children we're talking about. So make no mistake, I mean, getting rid of UNRWA is not just about stopping international staff working in Jerusalem. However, and I think, by the way, that, you know, you can transfer millions and millions of dollars from the bank from Jordan to the Bank of Palestine, and UNRWA workers can still be paid. And the question then, of course, is, you know, what can you buy with your disposable income? But the fact is that all the way through this genocide, we have a situation where UNRWA workers are being paid. Some of them, who I speak to all the time, are managing to feed their families. It's desperate. In the north, it's pretty much impossible. The population of the north has now decreased to just a few tens of thousands. But the fact is that in the south, which is what Israel there are obviously terrible attacks going on in the south, but the real attention, the real focus of Israeli firepower is in the north. But the fact is that certainly for the time being in the south, UNRWA workers valiantly and humbly are continuing. Now, if that can be done in a genocide in Gaza, there are far fewer workers. I think it's about 12,000 UNRWA workers. I may have got that figure a bit wrong, but about that in the West Bank. And I know Palestinians in the West Bank. They were my colleagues for many years. They will carry on working. It's going to take a lot. Bullets and genocide has not stopped UNRWA workers in Gaza doing their daily job. I was actually a very interesting anecdote. I was talking to a colleague, and I won't say his name, but I was asking after a particular friend whose son was killed and blah, blah, blah. And what he said was that my friend, he comes to the office every day in his suit. I said, well, he says, yeah, he comes in his suit, he's got a tie, and he basically says to me, the internationals are kind of slopping around in sort of, jeans and, trousers with zips all over them, blah, blah. But the Palestinian colleagues, as a matter of pride in Gaza, are going to work, they're doing their jobs, and they're drawing their salaries. Now, that seems to me to give great hope for what's going on in the West Bank.
Yeah. And it's clear, Chris, it's always been clear how much you care for Palestinians and for UNRWA. For you, it was always more than just a job, and your continued commitment to it. We appreciate it, Chris. Your continued commitment to UNRWA, to its people, and to the rights of the Palestinian people is something many of us appreciate.
Yeah. Now that I've composed myself, and sorry about that, the point I'm trying to make is that UNRWA staff, and that anecdote about my colleague going in a suit every day, I think that is really an icon, and it's emblematic of the fact that UNRWA is run and works because of Palestinian commitment to their communities and human development for the next generation. And although things are absolutely terrible, and they will get terrible in the West Bank, mark my words, I have no doubt that if you trust the Palestinians, you can't really go wrong. And that, they've lived through since 1948 what they've lived through, and they will carry on as a people surviving. I've worked with them for many years, and of that I have absolutely no doubt.
Chris, thank you. I think that beautiful and somewhat hopeful note is a good place to end our conversation today. But we hope it's actually been almost a year since we had you back.
I've missed you.
We missed you too.
and let's not wait another year. We really appreciate everything that you had to say today, and a lot. I was so determined
not to get emotional. It's when I start talking about individuals that if I can just do what the Palestinians say they hate, which is talking to them about numbers and statistics and donor relations and politics, so I can deal with that. The minute I talk about a single Palestinian friend or person, it just kills me. It destroys me.
Anyway. I think we all feel exactly the same.
We feel exactly the same way, and that's something that we know about you, that this is something you deeply feel, and we appreciate it, Chris. We love you for it. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks a million, Pamela. See you again.
Thank you so much, soon. Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Bye-bye.
Oh, wow. I so appreciate his, expert analysis and his big heart, and I think, and his commitment. Exactly. Yeah. And the warnings that he has been sounding for years and years about, what happens in Gaza, coming to the West Bank, the annexation of Jerusalem, the expansion of the settlements, the empowerment of these fanatical settlers and private corporations coming in to subvert and undermine the work, not just the work of UNRWA, but trying to erase the Palestinian refugee issue. And there's a lot that we have to do, and I'm so grateful for his commitment. Yeah. So I'm really glad we had him on today.
Yeah, and we'll just have to keep watching what happens with UNRWA, but we are in uncharted territory in so many ways, and this is a big thing that we will have to keep our eye on.
Yeah, and we will. Well, before we go to Jon and the resistance report, we wanted to bring you this short 3.5-minute speech that our dear contributor Abubaker Abed gave earlier today in Gaza at a press conference of journalists about the continued attacks and the hunting of Gaza's journalists. So let's go to that, and then we'll be back with Jon.
These are not my words, but the words of every single one here, standing here after 459 days of the most well-documented and first live-streamed genocide in history. For these days, we've been reporting tirelessly, extensively, and thoroughly on this genocide. It's indeed a genocide against us, which we've been documenting in makeshift tented camps and workplaces. They are really the places we've taken shelter since day one. You've seen us shedding tears over our loved ones, colleagues, friends, and family members. You've seen us killed in every possible way. We've been immolated, incinerated, dismembered, and disemboweled, and recently we've been freezing to death. What more ways should you be seeing us killed in so that you can move and act and stop the hell inflicted upon us? There are no words to describe what we've been going through, because you've seen our bodies, how they've become fragile, skinny, and fatigued. But we never stopped. We never stopped to tell you the truth, to narrate our stories, and to tell you that we are being genocided, to move your dead consciences, to help a population that has seen every sort of torture and tasted every type of death. Today, we're all standing here after Israel's impunity against us. And we don't know how many journalists should be killed so you can really act and stop Israel's impunity against us. Our message is very clear. We are journalists, and we are Palestinian journalists. We have been let down by the international community, particularly the international media organizations. We haven't seen any sort of support, a single word of support. Even the press vests we're wearing right now mark us as a target. They do not protect us at all. But yes, because we are Palestinians, maybe if we were Ukrainians or of any other citizenship with blonde hair and blue eyes, the word would rage and rant for us. But because we are Palestinians, we have only one right, which is to die and be maimed. Finally, we are just documenting a genocide against us. It's enough after almost a year and a half. We want you to stand foot by foot with us, because we are like any other journalists, reporters, and media workers all across the globe, no matter the origin, the color, or the race. Journalism is not a crime. We are not a target.
That's our dear friend and contributor, Abubaker Abed.
Extraordinary.
I saw that this morning as I was preparing for today's live stream, and it completely destroyed me. Just, he's the best of us. He is our strength, and we have to keep doing whatever we can to protect and lift up these courageous, these brave lions of Gaza, these journalists who are doing everything in their power to keep Gaza visible. So thank you, Abubaker. We are honored as always. Well, let's bring on Jon and the Resistance Report. Hey, Jon.
Hey, guys. Way to
Hi,
go,
Jon.
Abubaker. I was so proud of him doing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Chris. It was great to have Chris on, too.
Yeah.
Both
Donya.
represent Gaza, and Chris has represented Gaza for a long time. I can remember phoning Chris on my little Nokia phone back in the day, and he was the same way. If you had him on broad issues, he spoke fire, and if you talked to him on personal issues, you could see the humanity in him. And a lot of times that's rare it's rare in the world of Western journalism, for sure. And so I'm proud to be following both of those voices. So great show. And Donya, of course. Donya's work is amazing.
She's solid.
And
yeah.
You want to go right into
Jon.
the Resistance Report? I was going to say Donya's work is resistance, because those schools that she keeps running, and the way that to not interrupt the education of Palestinians, which is a primary objective of the Israelis, always fails. It always fails, and it's because of people like Donya. Quietly, no one in the world sees it, keeps another generation educated, and that is the highest form of resistance. So
indeed it is. Thanks for that, Jon. Okay, let's go right into the Resistance Report.
Let's do it. Okay, and I'll just start this off by the same way that I do every time. Everything you're going to see in these next half hour or so is from the previous week. All these videos are between now and our last show. So we're bringing you what is happening on the ground, and we'll take a look at these maps. And I think Nora did a great job showing, of course, like she always does to begin the show, recording the news of what's going on, and to just really distinguish the fact that the airstrikes and the death and destruction does not match the battlefield alone. Nora talked about the civilian police chiefs killed in Mawasi. If we zoom in, we can zoom in onto this next map, and you can see Mawasi is there between Deir al-Balah and Khan Yunis. It's along the coast there, and that's where the massacre that was claimed to be targeting the civilian police chief, but killed children and burned tents. There's no resistance in that area. That's not who is being targeted when we see these tent massacres. So just to understand that and to see that on the map of what we're talking about, it's the area in front of Khan Yunis, all along the sea, and it's sand dunes. It's not a livable area. There's not roads. There's not proper sanitation or sewage or all the things that Chris talked about that need to be. Mawasi doesn't have that. Mawasi wasn't previously a fully stocked city. It was a tiny little area that was trapped around the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 settlement, an Israeli settlement that ran all the way in front of Khan Yunis. Anyone growing up in Khan Yunis could see the sea, but they couldn't access it because 𝐓𝐡𝐞 was a settlement that ran along in front of Khan Yunis. And Al-Mawasi was a tiny area in that that was surrounded by that settlement. It didn't have infrastructure. It didn't have proper roads. It didn't have proper any kind of infrastructure, buildings that could be converted, schools that could become shelters. Mawasi doesn't have any of that. And that is what, when we talk about Mawasi, we're talking about people living on sand dunes on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea in the winter. And the flooding in Gaza is catastrophic when people were living in homes. The de-development of the Gaza Strip has been a principal objective of Israel's for 2 generations. And it's effective. And when the rains come, what we're seeing right now, it's devastating. The flooding is devastating. And so the safe area is a dangerous area. The safe zone of Mawasi is a dangerous area. because of Israel's attacks on civilians. And I just want to distinguish that from the resistance, because the civilians are not being killed around the resistance fighting. The civilians are being killed in areas that the resistance is not operating in. And that is the Israeli army writ large. And I just want to bring, I've been doing updates on the prisoner exchange and ceasefire talks that came out, a little more news on them. Still not, I don't think there's anything serious about this, but since I've been bringing them up to date, and the Mossad chief went to Qatar for talks, they're at least moving in a way that they weren't before. Apparently, Hamas is asking for clear demands, a clear commitment about Israeli withdrawal from, one, the Philadelphia corridor, which you're looking at there on the map, and the Netzarim corridor, that is, quote, backed by maps and rigid timetables. They don't want just some general idea that in the future, some point, they want maps and timetables for that. Hamas wants a clear agreement on the criteria for releasing thousands of Palestinian prisoners, not just vague gestures towards that. And of course, the biggest problem of these ceasefire exchange, these prisoner exchanges, is that nobody trusts Israel to follow through on their side of the deal. So what Israel wants from Hamas is a complete and detailed list of all the hostages. But we know since November of last year, the prisoner exchange, that Hamas is not holding all of the prisoners. Hamas has asked for a ceasefire to allow them time to find the other prisoners that are being held, the other captives that are being held by other groups, smaller groups, some criminal groups, some individuals. The hostages, the captives, are not held by Qassam. This is not something that Hamas can agree to in this position, because they don't hold a certain number of them. So that has been the position of Hamas since the beginning, is that they need a week plus to find people, and to safely do that without Israel flying overflight when they're going out and looking for them. And in November of last year, Israel said, we're not going to do that, and return to war. So this is all on Israel that this hasn't happened at now. And of course, Israel wants a partial deal. They want to try to get as many people back as they can before they go back to war. And so this is, again, a ceasefire that doesn't mean ceasefire. It's emptied of all of its meanings. But interestingly, I have a quote here. Salah Aruri, who was assassinated 1 year ago in Beirut, he is a Qassam founder and the West Bank chief. He did an interview. He was also the chief negotiator of the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 exchange, the Israeli tank gunner who was captured in a tunnel operation in 2006 on the border. Actually, right there on that map, you can look. It was just north of Khan Yunis, where he was captured. And he was exchanged for 1,100 Palestinians, including Yahya Sinwar. And he did an interview in 2017, so almost a decade ago, on Israeli, but also 6 years after the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 exchange. And in 2017, he said on the Israeli state broadcaster, Khan Channel 11, he said, "This is one of Israel's society's strong points, and I say this to everyone, that the country is willing to go to war over one soldier and free 1,000 prisoners for one soldier. That is something positive. As someone on the enemy side, it would be better for me. I'd be happy if Israel reached the point where the soldier or civilian doesn't interest it anymore. That would weaken its society. It would undermine its army, and it would undermine the entire Israeli society." So interesting quote from Salah Aruri, his assassination in Beirut. 1 year ago, we covered that he was a senior-most Qassam leader, and he was in Beirut. He was a strong connection with Nasrallah. And that's an interesting quote, that the Israel who would exchange 1,000 prisoners for one is a stronger state than the state that abandons their prisoners. And that's 6 years before Operation Al-Aqsa flood. Yeah, so let's look at number 3 because there's some operations here. Suraya Al-Quds mortar operation here against the Philadelphia corridor. The fighter says, "We remain steadfast, patient, and committed to the cause of Palestine. We do not tire defending it. We remember the blood of our martyrs who paved this path, and we pledge to continue on this path, martyrdom or victory." This operation is firing on the Israelis and capturing drones. And interesting, you can see the 2 cameras there on that drone. Take note of the 2 eyes at the top, and then the camera tilted down. That's a Mavic. This G, it's a Chinese company, DJI, that sells these drones, and these are a principal. They're the main innovation of this war from the Israeli perspective is the use of these drones tactically to case buildings and to see what's inside a building before you go in on a small unit level. They all have them. The soldiers all carry them, like literally individual soldiers carrying them, and they use them a lot. So it's kind of remarkable to see this. First of all, interesting that they're firing on the Philadelphia corridor in the same way that we'll see coming up, and we have seen over the last 15 months that they fire on the Netzarim corridor. So now these operations are settling in here. This week gave us a bit more time to cover some of these artillery units that we don't usually get a chance to cover because there's so much information. But you can see that drone. It's essentially a commercial drone. You could buy that off the shelf. And if you look at the next slide here, number 4, Tamara, you can see this Qassam captured in Rafah. There's quite a bounty here. You can look on the table. There's half a dozen of these, but these are makeshift drones. And you're going to watch, he pulls off the battery here and shows you. What he reveals to you is that these drones are put together by Flotilla 13 veterans organizations. You can see there's half a dozen of them. They're not the G drones. The Avata and the Mavic are the 2 key drones. These are makeshift drones, homemade drones. There you can see. And he lifts the battery off. You could see the battery is strapped on. So a lot of people over these months have been asking me for clues that the Palestinians are running out of weapons. And then this popped up in my feed, and this is a clue the Israelis are running out of weapons. These are makeshift drones supplied by Flotilla 13, which is like their Navy SEALs, the Israeli Navy SEALs. And you look at them. They're just pieced together. They look like essentially racing drones. They don't have the tilted cameras in the way that previous drone that Suraya captured had. You can see them on there. They need a brick battery strapped on by Velcro, and they're provided by this Flotilla 13 veterans organizations. So what's going on here? We'll have to follow this, but it sure looks to me like the Israelis are running out of drones. Yeah, so I just wanted to bring that to you because these drones have been a critical part of Israel's war fighting. And what we're seeing here is slapdash. There's no advantage to these drones we're looking at here. And obviously they're capturable because we're seeing a half a dozen of them there. So interesting note from the Philadelphia corridor and Israel's drone program. We'll look at number 5. We'll go up to the Netzarim corridor, which is again, still consistently targeted. I detailed the Netzarim corridor on last week's show. So if people want more in-depth on the corridor, you can go back and check out last week's resistance report. But on this one, we're going to just show you a number of operations against the corridor. Number 6, you have the PFLP Abu Ali Mustafa brigades targeting the Netzarim corridor in a joint operation with the Ansar brigades. Again, these are joint operations room operations where the units combine together. Do we have number 6? So we have 107 millimeter rocket artillery here, and you can see the Ansar brigades and the Abu Ali Mustafa brigades of the PFLP both putting their headbands on their rockets and rocket artillery. And you can see that these could be launched from multiple launch rocket systems, but these guys can fire these just as effectively from the ground. They don't require what Israel brags about knocking out when they say they knocked out a rocket launcher like they did in Lebanon, saying they knocked out rocket launchers. This weapon, to have it fired from, as long as you have the angles right, he's putting the fuse on here, as long as you have the artillery math, as they call it, the trigonometry, I guess it is. As long as you have that right, you get the distance, the angle, the trajectory. Firing it out of a hole in the ground is just as effective as firing it off a launcher. So we're seeing that happen. And you're seeing the Palestinians firing these without launchers on the same day. There was a lot of year-end stuff, and the Stockholm Institute for International Peace Research released a report saying that there had been $22 billion in weapons given to Israel since October 7th, which roughly matches what the Brown University Cost of War Project said. They said 23 billion recently, 22, 23 billion. We saw this week another 8 billion provided, and you see the resistance here, firing from dugout holes. And it's an effective tool, but it just shows you that the resistance is not going to, not only not going to surrender, but just because they lose a part of their weapon systems, it doesn't mean that that weapon system is then not used. They're just as effective. In fact, in some ways, they're more effective because they don't attract counterfire in the same way as having a battery, having a massive launcher system that could be seen and then tracked, and then the launcher gets blown up. And these guys are setting those fuses, and they're setting them on a timer, and they're gone. So even if there is counter battery fire, these guys are out of there. The Abu Ali Mustafa brigades, that was what was written on the rockets, on that 107 millimeter rocket artillery. But the fighter says in the background, the audio we took out, he says the Abu Ali Mustafa brigade's rocket unit targets the command and control of the Israeli military in the Netzarim corridor in response to their crimes against civilians in Gaza and our brotherly Yemen on December 30. So shout out to Yemen from the PFLP and the Ansar brigades in the Netzarim corridor. Number 8. Is this 7? This is 7. Yeah. So this is where you can see written on the shells, the PFLP fighter with his one finger up, the Marxists still giving a shout out to the one, using a piece of a roof here. Again, the destruction, using the destruction to their advantage. That's a piece of corrugated metal roof, the kind of roof that defines the refugee camps that have been blown up. And as long as you get the angle right, and you can see he's got his necessary devices for checking the angle, that's a perfectly good launcher. So ingenuity under very, very difficult circumstances. These are being fired from either side of the Netzarim corridor, both of them completely destroyed, supposedly under Israeli control. But these guys put lie to that all the time. And so that's the Abu Ali Mustafa brigades. And number 8 is 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜 and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs brigades. You can see their artillery tools there. And these are mortars. They're often Israeli mortars, captured Israeli mortars, but Qassam and Soraya both make their own 60 millimeter mortars. So that's what you're seeing here. There's the math. They're doing the geometry there, and the trigonometry, I guess. And those are attaching fuses to the end. And then you can see the arc of that is just a direct line. So they're just firing these very effective weapons directly on the command and control positions. So we don't get to show you these very often because there's always so much material to show. There hasn't been as much broadcast material over the last few weeks as usual. So it gives us an opportunity to show you what these guys do, because we haven't given enough attention to the artillery units. These guys are out here every day. No matter the circumstances, there's at least a dozen of these operations against the Netzarim corridor every single week. And we just don't fit them into the resistance report because, well, for one reason, because the frontline fighting gives camera work right up in the hits. When you're seeing Yasin strikes, you're seeing it from a camera right in front of the tank, whereas these are launched from a distance. And so it's harder to see because of the width of the corridor. It's harder to have a camera on where they land, but they land, and they're fragmentation warheads. They fire shrapnel out, and these kind of rocket attacks are what left what forced the Israelis to leave the Gaza Strip in the first place. So when people are talking about settlements in Gaza, just remember that these guys firing on these military positions in the Netzarim corridor, they would fire on the construction of any settlements in Gaza. So you can't, you have to keep that in mind when you're saying the goal for the Israelis is settlement in Gaza. It's not. It's unclear what their goal is other than destruction. And I think if we look at this map of northern Gaza, we can see to set up the battle in northern Gaza. Yeah, number 10. The Israelis are operating and have been now. This marks the 90. This week marked Monday marked the 90th consecutive day of the siege of Jabalia. That battle and Kamal Adwan Hospital. Kamal Adwan Hospital is technically in Beit Lahia. A lot of people saying it was in Jabalia, but the reason why is because it's a contiguous strip of land from Beit Lahia through Jabalia camp, through Jabalia, and into Gaza City. Tufa and Daraj and Shujaiya are Gaza City. They're just neighborhoods of Gaza City. The beach camp is the refugee camp right along the water. Tel El Hawa is the downtown core of Gaza City. So you have contiguous land, contiguous buildings all the way from Beit Lahia all the way to Gaza City. So this 3-month siege of Jabalia is actually not of Jabalia. It's of Beit Lahia so far. They've only been able to erase Beit Lahia, and they're now just this week began moving in on Beit Hanun. And they've doubled the pace of the airstrikes in Gaza. I think that matches the ceasefire talks, putting additional pressure on, because this week they doubled over previous days the number of airstrikes up to 100, and that is their principal method for destroying in Gaza, in the north in particular, is airstrikes. But that's only one of their 4 principal ways, because they use tank shelling and field guns. They use anti-tank mines, which we've talked about a lot over these last 15 months, where they literally rig up a house with anti-tank mines and blow it up. There's been a number of operations where the resistance has attacked those people carrying those mines or in buildings with those mines and created mass casualty events. One of the things that we're seeing in Beit Hanun and in Beit Lahia is the actual physical using of the bulldozers to drop buildings. Their goal is just to drop all the buildings that they can. Actually, there's a fifth way they do it, and that's new to this war, which is the truck bomb. The M113 Zelda is used. Elbit has an attachment for it to make it unmanned, remotely operated, and they fill up that troop carrier with explosives and drive it in and use it as a car bomb or a truck bomb or a tank bomb. So those have been the principal uses, the 5 main ways that they destroy in Gaza. And the Israeli Air Force announced that they had carried out 1,400 airstrikes in Gaza in December alone. And the number for the war overall is now over 50,000. And if we look at 11A here, Tamara, if we can, this is Haaretz allowed one of its journalists, the IDF allowed Haaretz, one of its journalists, into Gaza, and he went on an embed and produced this story. In Gaza's Jabalia, devastation seems to be the IDF's end goal, not the hostages return. And the article is interesting because, I mean, it's a horrific article because he's describing what he looks at, which you can see on the right there. If you go to the next slide, Tamara, that's the full screen of that photo, or maybe one back. There's a full screen. Yeah, there you go. The full screen of that photograph for that article just shows you the criminal level of destruction. And they bragged about how all 4,500 buildings in Jabalia camp had been knocked down. This is the 3rd major invasion of Jabalia. The one in May wiped out half of the southern edge of the camp. And then the one in November till the end of January 2023, 2024 was when they said that they controlled Jabalia. So this is the third time they're now going in, but they're not fully into Jabalia. They're still, like I said, in Beit Hanun. And they're promising this time, this is what they said in this Embeds article. They said previously, so the journalist asks, what about the captives? What about the captives? And the commander answers, that concerns us like it does everyone, but it isn't part of our operational considerations. We're exerting pressure to bring them back. That's our main vector. So it's not even in their goal of this to bring back captives, to look for them, to go down into tunnels. They're not doing any of that. They're just destroying the place. The commander says that it's difficult for us because clearing the area, the combat is complicated. Any boy can decide to be a Hamas member. And this unit's been there for 3 months. Like I said, 90 days is the siege on the north. And they bragged about 7 kilometers of tunnels being removed, which, as we know, the Israelis claim that there's more than 1,000 kilometers of tunnels. So they're not going in tunnels. They're not fighting in tunnels. And Qassam is going to reconstitute in these areas afterwards. But the Israeli military explained the goal they explained the goal as just destruction. So if we look at number 12, actually, was there one more? Okay. There was one more newspaper article, but yeah, look, just to throw it in. No hostage deal in sight. IDF is depopulating the north of Gaza out of sheer inertia. So this is what the newspapers in Israel are reporting. Sheer inertia, genocide for inertia. Just brutal. I just wanted to add that to it because it was the analysis beside the embed. And Army Radio explained Army Radio explained the purpose of the operation. After 3 of their soldiers fell in Beit Hanun in the past 24 hours, and after 53 have fallen in the past 3 months, what's the purpose of the operation? And the IDF said the operation is to allow people to return to the Gaza envelope, Israeli settlers to return to the Gaza envelope. This is not a raid operation. This is a maneuver, a ground maneuver for the purpose of completely destroying the enemy and all the infrastructure. To create a full occupation and cleansing operation, this takes time. So that's how the Israelis are seeing this right now. So if we look at number 12, Qassam still has the ability to fire rockets. They came out on New Year's and launched these. You can see that they're larger Qassam rockets. These are Q-18s, the larger end of the Qassam family of Qassam rockets. But of course, I'll show you in a minute. That's only the small end of their capabilities. And this is we still haven't got the best translation for it, but they're basically, the name of the launcher device is something like Iron Peace Enforcer. It's a play on words that's mocking the Iron Dome. And that sign says on day 453 of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. And these were rockets that they fired on New Year's that rang in 2025. And that were part of I think it was like 12 days, the last count, that they've been firing rockets for 12 days long after Israel said that they had no capacity to do so. And yeah, here you go. Named after Sheikh Izzeddin al-Qassam, who was killed in the hills around Jenin in 1935, and whose death started the armed struggle, and the Great Revolt would follow in a few months after that. And you can see the rocket specs on there: 30-kilogram fragmentation warhead with 20-kilometer distance, and the Q-20's been in service since 2020. And if we look at the next slide, you can see these are the Qassam family of Qassam rockets. The Q-20 from 2012, the QC-20 is 2020, 2018 is the one we saw. The Q-18 was founded in 2015, which we just saw there, and the Q-12 from 2022. And if we just go to the next slide, you can see where the Qassam rockets on the far left of the screen, that's the Qassam family. And then each of those rockets have their own other name, going all the way up to the Ayash 250. named after the engineer Yahya Ayash. And you can see the person on the right for size. A standard person is on the right-hand side. So you can see the size of the rocket arsenal. And we haven't seen these in a while, so it'd be interesting to see if this is a new trend. But the rockets fired this week were more than we have seen of late, so it might be a statement. And it drove the Israelis crazy. If we look at number 15, Tamara, the Israeli army radio correspondent got really upset about this, about how they were firing rockets from Beit Hanun. As soon as the Israelis entered Beit Hanun, the Palestinians started firing rockets from Beit Hanun right under their nose. But as you can see, it's right under their feet. They're hidden, buried rocket launchers. And the army moves in, because when the Israeli military moves in, they send in their local newspapers. They say, like, we're going into Beit Hanun, and they hype it up as this, we're going to destroy the rockets. And then immediately Ssaraya al-Quds peels back the ground, sets the rocket launcher up, and fires literally from the area that the Israelis are occupying. They could fire these rockets. These rockets exist all over Gaza, but the purpose of it is to show the Israelis, as soon as they move into a new area, that it doesn't matter. They'll fire from right underneath their nose. So, they're using it as a messaging system to the Israelis. This is another messaging system from Ssaraya al-Quds in the next video. This is Ssaraya operation in Jabalia, a return to sender operation. That's in military terms, it's called a 155. It's a 155 millimeter artillery shell. And these are the shells that the Ukraine wants so badly, and that Israel needed, and that the Americans were trying to supply them. These are also the shells that the idiot politicians write on, like when you see like Nikki Haley or, basically everybody does it when they go to Israel and they sign the shells that they fire. So this is interesting. Maybe one of these shells is signed by one of those idiot politicians, and now it's being used. It's being rewired, and it's being used against the Israelis. And that's what you're seeing here. The fighter travels across the ground and sets it in a building that the Israeli military is using and detonates it. So return to sender operation by Ssaraya al-Quds in Jabalia, in a booby-trapped house. Number of casualties in booby-trapped houses, not clear if that's exactly what we're seeing there, but that was something that happened this week. So you can see him there. He's got the shell. That's the shell that they would write on the side, and they all smile while they're doing it. They fire them at Lebanon. In the 2006, I feel like the 2006 war was when that dumb craze began, where you signed they had little kids come from a school and sign them, and it's just very reveals a lot about the Israelis. And now it's caught on, and you can see it happening everywhere. In any case, you can see the fighter there. He's in the circle. Two fighters move into that building. The Israelis are in the front of that building, and they wire it up and detonate it. And this video, this was turned around within 24 hours of the field report. So that's something that's interesting to note, that the comms network is still fully functioning despite the absolute devastation of Jabalia. If we look at number 17 here, look at that destruction. It's just unbelievable. Here's a Merkava tank being hit by a barrel bomb. And then the fighters are going to wire up a Shawad, an EFP, and they're going to hit the reinforcements that come in after that. So that's what the fighter's doing here. He's wiring up that Shawad canister, and there's no shortage of those canisters. I don't anticipate them running out of those canisters, and those canisters can be refilled with unexploded ordnance. And they're devastating. There was an operation in Beit Hanun that killed 3. And so then that's the reinforcements coming to the same spot as the previously targeted tank, and they get hit really hard. They get hit on the back end, which is the weakest point at the rear door, which is where the infantry cabin is, which has the soldiers. And it's also where the ammo storage is, at the back of the tank. So that's a significant operation. This was one of 11 IEDs that targeted tanks in the last week since you last saw me. And this field report was also 24 hours before this video was launched. So it sounds like it seems like their comms units are very sharp. At least 9 soldiers were killed this week in operations. And number 18 here, you're going to see a tandem 85 that we've pointed out before and explained. These are these belong to Qassam and Qassam only. I froze it there for you. You can see that they take an old stock anti-tank weapon RPG that no longer works against the thickness of a Merkava armor, and they add a second charge. They add that front nose to it, a precursor charge that will set off the reactive armor so that the second round can go inside. So if you strike right, it's effective. And the Israeli media reported four killed in a tank and 2 seriously wounded. So that's what happens when the tank gets penetrated by one of these rounds. It's not clear if it was the Tandem 85 or a Yasin 105, which is a bit stronger. But they're penetrating these tanks. That's when you get these casualty reports. It's because the shape charge metal arrow dart enters inside the cabin of the tank, and it bounces around, and that's when you get 4 killed, 3 seriously wounded, because that's how many people. There's 8 people in the back of the tank, and you hit it. The other way to do it is the way that happened apparently overnight last night. And according to reporting in the Israeli media, 3 soldiers were killed from the 401st Armored Brigade and 3 seriously wounded in an IED operation that was so powerful, according to Israeli media, the turret of the tank was blown off the chassis of the tank. So what you're seeing there is a Merkava tank there. And you can imagine what it would be like if the turret was blown off. So, and then number 19 here, you can see a destroyed D9 armored bulldozer from Caterpillar lying in pieces in the streets of Jabalia. So clearly successful operations happening. That the Israelis would move that tank out. That means that you have fighters all around that battle space. There it is from the front. The D9 bulldozer destroyed. So just not surprisingly, Israel's lying. There is still fighters in Jabalia. There are many fighters in Jabalia, and we're seeing their operations carry out. A number of operations came through just after our production deadline, so there'll be many more for next week. And I wanted to just do a quick touch on the West Bank to wrap up the resistance report here, because the ferocious resistance, and also just because it's the first after the new year, this is 1,143 armed clashes in the West Bank. You can see that's Jenin in the north, 434. That's Tulkarm, 158. That's Nablus, 268. That's Tubas, 108. That's Qalqilia, 63. And then these ones get, I think that's Salfit and Ramallah, Bethlehem, Jericho, and Hebron. Maybe we can roll that one more time. But it gives you an idea of the north, because you're talking about, Abdul Jawad points it out too, because whenever I was saying, any other time we'd be calling this an intifada, and Abdul Jawad, I think rightly said, an intifada in the north of the West Bank. These numbers clearly show that 450, 150. So in the triangle of terror, as the British used to call it, in those top 4 ones, is the overwhelming majority of the operations. There's still operations in every other place. The bottom there, 40, that's Hebron. So just interesting to point that out, that these resistance operations are carrying on fiercely in the West Bank. This is the Jenin brigades, the engineering unit of the western front of the Jenin brigades, showing off their various sized IEDs, and we show them blowing up, but we don't often get to see them in their before they blow up. So when we're blowing up streets underneath streets, that's what they're doing. And they're various different sizes, different potencies, and different placements for them. the Jenin brigades showed us that. And of course, we're now more than a month into the siege of Jenin by the Palestinian Authority, that's being led by American Security Coordinator Lieutenant General Michael Fenzel of the United States Army, who serves as the U.S. coordinator. And it's being framed by the Israelis and the U.S. coordinator as make or break for the PA. And it's actually being said that for the PA too. A PA source told Haaretz that Jenin is an important fight for the PA and its security branches. It's a matter of to be or not to be. And the people who are opposed to Palestinian Authority security coordination, I think will be hoping that it is a make or break, because it's going to break. It's not going to be successful. They're not going to be any more successful than the Israelis are in breaking the resistance. And it's just this camp-wide siege is now into its third month. And the coming days, Tamara has a piece coming out following that I will hope that you guys will check out, and I will mention it on next week's show. There's just not very much coverage of that. So this is these operations now. This is in Tubas. This is an IED in Tubas against a convoy. And you're going to see here the MDT David towing one of the destroyed vehicles from Tubas. So you can see from Jenin, the operation, the IEDs that Jenin showed, and then that's what it looks like when you just see the ball of flame. So to give you the before and after is an important thing to note. So that is the resistance report for this week. We will be back with more next week.
Thank you so much, Jon. I mean, so much to get into, but the images of the Israeli drones, I think was really important and interesting to point out. And I also, I can't remember if you mentioned this in your report, Israel only has a few battalions left in Gaza. So there's like speculations that not only are the weapons maybe running out for the Israelis, but morale, let's say, is also running very thin.
Well, they have more than a division level. So they have something like 6 battalions in fighting in the siege in the north, but they pulled out their unit from Rafah. So that happened just the other day. And it's unclear if they're going to replace them, which would be interesting, because that would mean that the end of the operation in Rafah is now just the Philadelphia corridor. They need a lot of troops to carry out these operations. The resistance is fighting with a fraction of the number that the Israelis are fighting, and they're fighting them fiercely. But these are the questions long term. And Salah Haruri, I read that quote from him at the beginning. It's like morale in the army is low. They're trying to get ultra Orthodox to serve, but the numbers are barely register.
Right.
They're trying to set up more reserve units, but they have significant numbers of people who are not reporting back to their units from the reserves. So these kind of long-term fight, we've been saying this for more than a year, that Israel's not capable of this long-term fight. And it's one of the reasons why they needed a ceasefire in Lebanon and asked for a ceasefire in Lebanon. Now we know also they asked for a ceasefire in Lebanon because they could see what was happening in Syria and wanted to cement that. But they're not able to carry out decades-long quagmire in Gaza. They're going to be hit consistently. The resistance is not, everything is destroyed. So the resistance is hurting. There's no question about it. But it's costly for everybody. It's costly for the Israelis. It's costly for the Palestinians. And it can't go on indefinitely.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of the Lebanon ceasefire, there's only 10 days left on the calendar until that apparently expires. And there's been more than something like 350 violations by Israel since the ceasefire began in November. So,
and it would depend what you would call a violation, because they're doing like demolition. They're
Yeah,
moving
they're
forward.
razing entire villages in South Lebanon to the ground.
And they moved forward into areas that they couldn't get in the war. And are destroying things. So does that count? If you destroy a building, does it count as one violation? If you move 10 tanks up into areas that they couldn't take before, like Wadi Saluki, which is Wadi Hajar, which is known as the graveyard of the Merkava, they moved into Wadi Hajar. It's the most cowardly form of warfare. Just everything that we see from the Israelis, but this particular one where you call a ceasefire, the Hezbollah fighters are out of that area, and then you move forward into areas that historically you got destroyed in, famously destroyed in, so that people will talk about Wadi Hajar in 2006 for generations to come, where the Israelis got destroyed. There was a speech by Naim Qassem, who's the new Secretary General of Hezbollah, and he talked about the end of, because the 60 days ends like literally the day Trump takes office. And he was sort of saying, that they might be patient, they might not be patient. He wasn't giving exactly, he wasn't tipping his hand on whether 60 days will be the day that the war starts back up, or what. He kept the upper hand. It was a strong speech on the 4th of January, just a few days ago. And he spoke to the Arab regimes too, that you were talking about, Ali. And he said to them, he said, why, the people who are asking us why we fight, we ask you why you don't fight. Like, at what point in this genocide is it going to move people in these neighboring countries, you'd think cultural allies, cultural brothers in these countries? It's a very cowardly way of warfare.
I mean, that there is now this feeling of euphoria in Israel, at least among the leadership, that Israel is on top of the world. And I think it's an illusion. I mean, what you said, Jon, is very important, that this is very costly for everyone. We don't want to pretend it isn't costly for Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, or for Lebanon, or for Hezbollah. They say we've paid a high price. But, the events in Syria capped a series of events that made Israel feel very euphoric. And the arrival of Trump is adding to that, even though there's literally nothing more Biden could have done for Israel. And as his parting shot, he's giving them another $8 billion for weapons. But maybe it's a conversation for another day, that Israel's strategic situation is not great and is not really improving. And I can sort of give a sneak preview of next week's discussion. We're going to have Shir Hever back on, who we've had a couple of times, and who I know people really, really got a lot out of his insight and analysis into what's happening within Israeli society. And he's also going to tell us more about the growth of military embargoes on Israel that's really happening now. So that's an aspect that we need to come back to, what's happening within Israel now at 16 months of this horrific genocide.
Yeah, that'll be a really important conversation. So be sure to tune in next week, of course. We have a couple of things we want to talk about before we wrap, Ali.
It's, almost a year to the day since we did that big debunking of the New York Times Screams Without Words, Jeffrey Gettleman article that purported to put meat on the bones of Israel's claims of October 7th rapes. And it turned out to be a complete journalistic fraud, as we showed at the Electronic Intifada, and people can go back and find that video on our channel. Of course, we have talked about that several times, the rape hoax. It won't go away. And there's a couple of big updates on it that I wanted to get into. So, of course, I doubt many people don't know what I'm talking about, but for those who don't, one of Israel's main propaganda claims is that on October 7th, there was an organized campaign of mass rapes by Hamas fighters of Israeli women and even of Israeli men. And as we've been saying consistently and showing through our investigations, in fact, to this day, there is not one single identified victim, living or dead, of a rape on October 7th, 2023. Not one. That remains the case to this day. But you don't have to believe the Electronic Intifada if you don't want to, because we have always pointed to our sources. And now there is a new one that we reported on this week that I wrote about. And this is an interview that appeared in the Israeli newspaper, or in the magazine of the Israeli newspaper, Yedi'ot Ahronot, which is one of the main newspapers in Gaza. And that's it. It's an interview with a senior Israeli prosecutor called Moran Gez, and she was in charge of the southern district of Israel. There was even a picture of her on the Ynet headline, but I don't know if we have it. But that's just to give a sense of it, where she talks about the effort to quote unquote bring to justice the hundreds or maybe even unknown number of Palestinians captured by Israel on October 7th and since October 7th. And she reveals in this interview that to this day, it was published on January 1st this year, there are still zero. There we go. Yeah, I just think, the way I wanted people to see that, because like she's this intrepid prosecutor marching towards justice, and the way they framed it, I thought people should see that. Thank you for pulling that up, Tamara. So Moran Gez is her name, and what she reveals in this interview is that to this day there are still zero complainants in alleged cases of rape committed by Palestinians on October 7th. In other words, they haven't found a single victim. And as I mentioned, she was in charge of, bringing about these prosecutions, none of which have actually happened yet. And she said a lot of horrifying things in this interview, which of course we had translated to English. She calls for mass executions of all the Palestinians detained on October 7th, even without any substantial evidence against them of any particular crime. She makes that clear. She says, anyone who entered Israel from Gaza on 7 October to kill or to loot, it doesn't matter, should be included in the indictment, and as far as I'm concerned, receive the death penalty. And Tamara, you could show item 2, which is our article, which contains the quotes that I'm reading so that people can find it. And there's the headline of our article on the Electronic Intifada published on January 6th. Israel still can't find any 7 October rape victims, prosecutor admits. And she told her colleagues, the other prosecutors, why she thinks everyone they captured should be executed. And she says, because of those who didn't murder but looted, burned, stole, picked avocados, as some claim, because of this mess, the Israeli army forces were unable to arrive in time. You came to the door with a drill and opened it to loot, then a terrorist came in and murdered civilians there. So in other words, if you just picked avocados on October 7th, avocados planted on land stolen from Palestinians in 1948. For example, the Abu Sitta family, whose village of Ma'in Abu Sitta is right where some of those kibbutzes are. Of course, we spoke with Donya Abu Sitta earlier. If you picked an avocado, you get the death penalty, according to her. And she also admits, and this is not just about the sexual crimes, but in general, that Israel has little evidence against any specific individual. She says, or as 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐿 puts it, quote, "The biggest difficulty is evidentiary," Gez explains, "using evidence to link a specific crime to a specific defendant when dealing with dozens of crime scenes where hundreds of suspects were caught and thousands of offenses were committed is almost impossible." And so what she says is we have to change the rules, basically, so that you don't need evidence. And she explicitly advocates bringing back military courts for Palestinians from Gaza. And people may know that Palestinians in the West Bank are brought before military courts where the conviction rate is 100%, and they are presumed guilty. But Israel actually abolished the military courts for Palestinians from Gaza after the so-called disengagement. So in theory, when a Palestinian enters Israel and commits what Israel considers to be a crime, they're actually supposed to be tried in an Israeli civilian court. Now, there are many stories of why, they don't get fair trials either, but she wants to explicitly bring back military courts to do away with the need for any sort of due process or evidence.
She's admitting the role of the military courts.
Yeah, basically. I mean, it's too difficult to find evidence against a particular individual. So why bother? Just go to the military court and proceed to execution. Now, I should make clear that she does say that she doesn't think it's likely that they're going to use the death penalty, but she really wants that, and she advocates for it. And that's just a sign of the quality of so-called justice Palestinians can get. But I think one of the key revelations here is her admission that basically Israel has zero evidence of October 7 rapes, totally destroying its biggest, most poisonous propaganda narrative that is still being used to justify the ongoing genocide. And in the interview with Yedi'at Ahronot, Ynet, Gez confirms that 15 months later, after the alleged events, Israel still has not identified a single victim in which a prosecution can be brought against an alleged perpetrator. Quote, "Unfortunately, it will be very difficult to prove these crimes," she said. "In the end, we have no complainants," Gez admitted, and she notes the vast gap between public perceptions and the reality. Quote, "Comparing what was presented in the media to what will come together in the end, it will be altogether different," Gez said. And she offers the usual spin that this is either because the victims were murdered or because women who were raped are not ready to reveal it. But this excuse really does not wash for why there have been no victims, because there is zero forensic evidence. Israel acknowledges that. Zero video or photo evidence. Credible eyewitness evidence is totally absent. And that's remarkable, especially when these rapes were supposedly, we're not talking about one or two isolated incidents. They're claiming this was an organized mass campaign of rape that was happening all over the place on October 7th. And as far as living victims are confirmed, she says, that they don't have any complainants. And she said, we really tried to find some. She says, quote, "We turned to women's rights groups and we asked for cooperation. They told us that they were simply not approached." In other words, no victims came forward. Sorry, Nora, you wanted to say something.
No, I think I was just reacting. Yeah, I mean, this yeah, no, go ahead.
Yeah, and so this is the prosecutor in charge of prosecuting these cases, or she just left that position. So until very recently, she was in charge of them. So she's saying we tried, we searched everywhere. No, the rape crisis centers, no victims. And this corroborates, people will recall, speaking of the Jeffrey Gettleman article that we debunked a year ago, this corroborates the experience of the New York Times, which extensively canvassed Israeli hospitals, rape crisis centers, sexual assault hotlines, and other specialized facilities, and they could not find a single victim of a 7 October sexual attack. Remember, Anat Schwartz, one of the journalists on that byline with Jeffrey Gettleman, gave an interview to Israel's Channel 12 last year, and she said that she was the one who actually did the canvassing for the New York Times, going to every hospital and rape crisis center in Israel. And she said, quote, no one had met a victim of a sexual assault. But of course, instead of taking the hint, that there is no story here, the New York Times said, well, there are no victims, let's make some up.
Yeah.
Good old New York Times, all the news that's fit to print. And of course, that journalistic fraud fell apart and engulfed the New York Times in scandal. But now we have it from an Israeli prosecutor: no victims, no evidence. The word she actually uses in the interview is, we have to lower expectations about this.
Yeah.
So what happens? Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
This is what we've been saying all along, that there's not only no evidence of rape on the 7th of October, but there's no allegations. There's no named victim. There's no unnamed victim. There's no, you could say, okay, if a rape had taken place, there would be a case for having an anonymous victim speak in the media. That hasn't happened either. There's nothing here. There's no substantive allegation except for the wide, rape must have happened on the 7th of October because Palestinians are just so evil. It's the evidence is literally the imagination of the colonizer.
And it's a lie that's not just been used to generate, sympathy for Israelis, the only and eternal victims, in order to gin up, support for the genocide that's now in its 16th month. But it's been used by U.S. politicians very recently, all the time. Didn't Kamala Harris, in one of her final speeches before she lost in the election in November, she was still talking about not just the mass rapes of Israeli women, but also, I believe, the 40 beheaded babies lie. I mean, it just, all of these completely fabricated, easily debunked hoaxes that have just, what did Goebbels say? If you repeat a lie enough times, it becomes the truth. That's essentially what we keep seeing.
And
shameful.
Tamara, I meant to ask you to put up number 3, which should just, again, is a reminder for people of our debunking a year ago. See there, 9 January 2024, a year ago today, that this article was written, and that we debunked this massive hoax that the New York Times put out. And the headline, for those who are listening, watch New York Times investigation of mass rape by Hamas falls apart. But that's not the only update. What I just gave you, the interview with the Israeli prosecutor on this mass rapes hoax story. Another story appeared in Haaretz yesterday. And Tamara, I am not sure if I actually gave you that headline to show. I certainly meant to, but the headline is, in the Haaretz story, Israel blocks UN probe into Hamas sexual crimes from October 7th to avoid inquiry into Hamas abuse. And I will...
there we go.
Oh, okay. Thank you. You're faster than me, Tamara. Thank you. And I apologize for that. But yeah, this story that is in Haaretz says that, let me find my spot in my notes here. Israel is blocking the United Nations from investigating sexual crimes committed by Hamas during its October 7th attack, fearing it would require granting access to probe allegations of sexual violence against Palestinians in Israeli detention. A thorough investigation could have led to Hamas being added to the UN's blacklist of entities suspected of sexual violence in conflicts, according to Haaretz. Now, this Haaretz story refers to plans for Pramila Patten, the UN Secretary General's representative on sexual violence and armed conflict, to come back to Israel and conduct a probe into alleged sexual violence. You'll recall that Patten published a rather shoddy report last year that laundered many of Israel's claims, but despite that, Patten did debunk many of Israel's lies in her report. And Tamara, if you could put up item number 4, you can see the Electronic Intifada story by me and Asa last March, discussing in detail the Pramila Patten report. And in that report, Patten and her team had to concede that they were unable to locate a single victim and did not speak to any alleged survivors of sexual violence or rape from October 7th. And they said that they reviewed thousands of photos and videos provided by Israel and from open sources and could not find any tangible evidence of rape in them, and that they had not been shown any forensic evidence whatsoever. But now Israeli government-aligned women's groups who have been pushing the October 7th mass rapes hoax want Pramila Patten to come back and do a more detailed investigation, according to Haaretz, which reports, quote, Patten's office warned that Israel's resistance to UN investigations into alleged crimes attributed to it could backfire, according to representatives of the Israel's Women's Network who met with Patten's team late last month. They further said they were told that Israel's approach could result in its inclusion on the UN's blacklist of entities responsible for sexual violence in conflicts, while Hamas could remain off the list.
Remember, there was that whole series of protests by Israelis, banging on a prison door, protesting for the right to rape Palestinian detainees.
Right. Yeah.
And one of the alleged rapists of Palestinians in I believe it was Sidi Tayman, was he was doing these media interviews with a mask on, and then in one Israeli media interview he revealed himself, and instead of being publicly shamed or prosecuted for the sexual abuse of Palestinians, he became an Israeli media darling. He went on a tour of Israeli stations, boasting, bragging about how he had committed rape.
The right to rape protest. So,
yes.
So they're saying that, if Israel doesn't let the UN investigate, then then Israel will end up on the list, and Hamas will get away scot-free with its alleged rapes because Israel isn't allowing access to victims, isn't allowing, that's their line.
Right.
But that's very disingenuous, because I do not believe the basic premise of this Haaretz article that Israel is blocking the UN probe just because it doesn't want its own crimes investigated, exactly the ones you just mentioned, Nora. That may be one motivation. I think the real reason, which is of course not acknowledged by Haaretz, but was acknowledged by the prosecutor Moran Gez, is that there is no evidence of Hamas carrying out any rapes on October 7th. So the worst case scenario for Israel would be to allow in a UN team to conduct an independent investigation and end up publishing a report saying, as previous UN reports have said, that we couldn't find any evidence for this massive claim. We couldn't find any victims. There was no forensic evidence. We looked at the same thousands of photos and videos that Pramila Paten's team looked at, and we still couldn't find any rapes. The eyewitnesses' stories all fell apart and so on. That would be the worst case. So the best way for Israel to keep the mass rapes hoax alive is by blocking an investigation and keeping a cloud of uncertainty around the whole thing. You know, maybe it happened, maybe it didn't happen, is better than it definitely didn't happen.
Right.
Because we had an independent investigation, the UN couldn't find anything.
Yeah, so, I'm generally unsurprised, generally speaking, that Israel wants to block another investigation by the UN into the events of October 7th because they just they don't want any risk of the truth accidentally coming out, right? Like even with people like Pramila Paten doing their best to and her team in that report doing best to kind of whitewash and to kind of launder Israel's false narrative about the alleged sexual abuse that took place on October 7th. She still accidentally, as you mentioned, she still accidentally found almost despite the intentions, found all this contrary evidence to it and found nothing substantial, like you said. And other UN reports have done similar things. So when there was the UN report, as I wrote about in one of my articles in October, there was this UN report into, it was supposed to be a kind of balancing report, the UN report into the Palestinian military offensive on October 7th, the Al-Aqsa flood operation. And the whole point of it was that it was supposed to document alleged war crimes by Hamas. But within that report, as I wrote about, the UN team ended up finding all this evidence that actually a lot of those people, a lot of the Israelis killed on October 7th, were killed by Israel itself, by under the Hannibal Directive, and they were kind of forced to write about the Hannibal Directive because that was the reality that they found when they started investigating it. They didn't get very far, they didn't get as far as we've done by a long shot. But nonetheless, that report, which the whole point of it was supposed to show how evil Hamas is, ended up showing, well, actually, Israel killed a lot of these people. So, I'm not surprised they want to block this as well.
Yeah, and this is an important thing about these UN reports that I think I want to take a minute to explain, because the UN is a political body. I mean, politics is there at every level. We heard Chris Gunness say that earlier in a different context, talking about UNRWA. And so there is this massive pressure campaign on the UN by Israel and its lobby, and mobilizing these fake Israeli feminist groups to put pressure on the UN to say, oh, you refuse to believe Israeli women just because they're Jewish. The UN is biased because it refuses to recognize Israeli women as victims of these rapes. So what happens is Pramila Paten, who's the political appointee of the Secretary General, the representative for sexual violence in conflict, goes to Israel, writes this report. It's not a full investigation. It's just she goes there and she looks at things. And she comes back and she bends over backwards. I mean, the spin that's put on the report tries its best to give as much credence to the Israeli allegations as possible. And that's in the headline of the report, that's in the executive summary, that's in the press release that goes out. And then that's what makes the headlines in the mainstream media, because the mainstream media are not sitting down and reading the 300-page report. They are going off the press release, which is putting in this spin. We are the ones who are reading the 300-page report and finding, on page 85 or 137 or whatever it is, the paragraph that says we couldn't verify a single allegation of rape, the paragraph that says we looked at thousands of photos and videos, we couldn't see any tangible signs of rape, we couldn't find any forensic evidence, and so on and so forth. So that's why these UN reports, often the real conclusion, the real meat of it is the opposite of the headline that's in the press release or the executive summary. So I just, and we're going to see more such reports coming out for sure. And it's important to keep that in mind. You can't go off the press coverage of these reports. You have to actually read them. And we do that for you here at the Electronic Intifada with our highlighters, with our expo markers to remember our friend 𝐓𝐡𝐞. That's our weapon, our expo markers going through these reports with a fine-tooth comb. But I want to just say, if I can, just take a minute to point out that, Nora, of course, you brought up the horrific, huge amount of evidence of Israeli sexual violence of Palestinians, sexual torture of Palestinians, and in the past 15 months, in contrast to Israel. Because remember, one of the excuses that Israel gives is, the victims of October 7th rapes are either dead. Well, then where's the forensic evidence? Where's the photographic evidence? There's none. But they say, they're dead, or they're just too traumatized and too ashamed to come forward. Well, presumably Palestinians would be no less traumatized and ashamed to come forward with accounts of sexual torture and rape and violence and victimization. And yet many Palestinians have come forward with detailed accounts either of being victimized firsthand or eyewitnessing sexual violence and torture by Israel. And those reports keep coming out. And just very recently, the Euromed for Human Rights, which is one of the groups that has been doing incredible work collecting and documenting and corroborating these testimonies, put out and I think we can just show the headline, that's item 5, Tamara, of sexual assaults by Israeli forces in the context of the attack, the ransacking of Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza, just in the last few weeks, of course, the hospital from which Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya was abducted. And I just want to share a few sentences of that. And it is, I have to warn people, I'm going to read disturbing accounts from some of the people there, but just to give a sense of what Israel is doing now, continuously ongoing, of the accounts where Euromed documents that at Kamal Adwan Hospital, Israel detained dozens of women and girls, subjecting them to severe abuse amounting to sexual harassment alongside degrading treatment that violated their human dignity. This included beating them and forcing them to remove their hijabs and clothing. One of the women expelled from the area told the Euromed team, quote, "A soldier forced a nurse to take off her trousers, then placed his hand on her. When she tried to resist, he struck her hard across the face, causing her nose to bleed." Another woman reported that a soldier told a woman in their group, "Take it off or we'll force it off you." In another incident, a woman refused to remove her headscarf, prompting a soldier to tear her clothes, exposing her chest. One victim recounted being dragged by a soldier who forced her to press against him, saying, "Take it off now," while hurling obscene remarks at her. Similarly, a hospital staff member told Euromed, quote, "The soldiers ordered us to remove our hijabs, but we refused. They then turned to the girls under 20 years old and demanded they remove their hijabs, but they also refused. The soldiers decided to punish us by taking 2 women at a time and forcing them to lift their clothes and lower their trousers under threats and coercion." And that's just a part of the testimonies coming out of Kamal Adwan. And I'd ask people, how much have you heard about this on the BBC or the CBC or in the New York Times or the Washington Post that have been screaming nonstop for 15 years about the imaginary invented October 7 rapes.
Exactly. Thanks, Ali. It's not easy to pore through these reports and to read these testimonies and to see video evidence of the sexual violence and torture that Palestinians are being forced to endure. But this is incredibly important to keep this documented and to keep, to be able to put a wrench into this, into this system of just absolute lies meant to justify a Holocaust in the most depraved way. So thanks for keeping on this story. And I know there will be much more to come. All right, let's take a look at the website. So many features we published this week, as well as in-house staff analysis. There's David Cronin's piece, Why Did Brussels Give VIP Treatment to an Israeli War Criminal? David Cronin, bless his heart, is he's always on the trail after these insipid EU politicians. So yeah, read that. Of course, we have Abubaker Abed's feature just at the top there about kidney dialysis patients that I read from in the news report. Yeah, go ahead, Ali.
No, I was just going to say, in the context of Abubaker's story, that just today I saw that the official death toll in Gaza today passed 46,000, which is the deaths that are confirmed and documented by the authorities in Gaza. We all know that that's talking about, I don't know what you would call war deaths, people being killed in bombings or shot, or all the horrific ways Israel killed people. And we know that's an underestimate. It doesn't. I mean,
that was a figure from from almost a year ago that has been pretty stagnant.
It's been going up, but that shows you how cautious and conservative the medical authorities are in Gaza, that they don't add people to the numbers until they can verify them. And it doesn't count the thousands of people who have disappeared, or who may be under rubble, or whose remains may have been destroyed. So it's a much higher number. But I'm saying, even if we knew the real number of people who have been killed by direct violence, that still doesn't count the number of people who have died of chronic diseases that they can't get treated, whether it's dialysis, people with cancer, people who need medicines to treat serious chronic conditions. There we're talking about just enormous numbers of people. And for those who are suffering with these, without diabetes medicines, without thyroid medicines, without kidney dialysis, without, that's not even in the consciousness of most people thinking about this genocide. And yet that's the reality for hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza.
Yeah.
And so Abubaker highlights the never-ending struggle of people who need dialysis, when most of the dialysis units in Gaza have been shut down and destroyed.
Yeah. There's so much, and of course hypothermia, and 8 infants right now, and we have that feature by Tagreed Ali.
This piece by Iman Hillis, which really touched me, about was that about by Fida al-Qidra. The 7th, of course, was Orthodox Christmas. And so this really moving piece by Fida al-Qidra about the very small remaining Christian community in Gaza marking Christmas on, this year, both on December 25th and Orthodox Christmas, and many fearing that it will be their last Christmas.
Unreal. Thank you. So yes, please check out our features and our op-eds and our posts, news and analysis at electronicintifada.net. Of course, hit the Donate Now button at the very top if you are compelled and are able to donate to keep this publication and this live stream running. Sign up for our email list, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Keep in touch with us. And I just also want to say, of course, thank you so much, as always, to Tamara Nassar for production and direction of this live stream. Thank you to Maureen Claire Murphy, our senior editor, to Michael Brown for fact-checking, Ellie Gerzon for social media. And on behalf of myself and Asa and John and Ali and Tamara, thank you all for joining us. We'll be back next week.